Dr. Andrew Salter in the 1940s began using assertiveness as a technique of helping his clients, his patients, who would come to him and complain of depression, who would complain that other people were taking advantage of them and they didn't know how to stand up for themselves. As a matter of fact, he started to encourage people to tell others off. In those days, it was not assertiveness training. It was really more aggressiveness training. Story goes that Andrew Salter would say to his clients, if they complained of continued depression, "Have you forgotten to insult somebody?" So it was encouraging people to actually stand up for themselves in a rather aggressive fashion and just to tell people off.
Welcome to Assertiveness Training with Dr. Helga Rhode. This program was taped before a live audience during one of Helga's popular assertiveness seminars. Before we begin, let me tell you a bit about your presenter. Powerhouse, that's Dr. Helga Rhode. You know where she's coming from the moment you hear her speak. She simply doesn't have time to pull any punches. She's truly one of the favorites among the career track trainers because of her style, her hard-hitting information, and her wonderful sense of humor. She's unforgettable. She earned her degree in behavioral psychology from the University of Denver and has many years of experience in teaching professionals how to put the concept of assertiveness to use in the real world. As you listen to the program, here's a tip on how to get the most from it. Whenever you hear an idea that's especially useful to you personally, stop the tape and write it down. Then, when you've finished listening, you'll find that you've created your own personal action plan. Another word of advice: put these skills to work right away. Research proves that the sooner you implement a new behavior, the better your chances of making it a permanent part of your life. Remember, it's not what you know, but what you do with what you know that counts. And finally, listen to the cassettes several times. The more times you listen, the more you'll retain. Now, Assertiveness Training with Dr. Helga Rhode.
In the 1950s, Dr. Joseph Wolpe began doing some very systematic research to see whether assertion made a difference in people's lives, whether there were some physiological changes occurring as a result of standing up and speaking out. And what he found was that people's anxiety was lowered, actually reduced, as a result of standing up for themselves. He used biofeedback equipment to measure muscle tension and skin temperature and so on, and he found some actual physiological changes as a result of standing up for oneself and speaking out. What he found essentially is that assertion and anxiety were incompatible behaviors, that assertion inhibited anxiety. Not only that, people who used assertion in order to establish their rights with other people reported feeling less angry. They said, when I can speak up about my rights, when I tell people what's on my mind, I just feel less angry. I don't feel the need to spout off and to have a temper tantrum. Since those days, assertiveness has been put to the test. We have used it with any population you can think of. It has been used in mental hospitals. It has been used with children. It has been used in business settings. It has been used in all kinds of settings in order not only to do research, but also to help people feel better about themselves. Today, assertiveness is the accepted business language, probably as a result of the new ways of managing people. The new ways of managing people actually demand that we know how to be honest and straightforward with people, that we give feedback to people, both positive and negative, that we know how to delegate without stepping on other people's toes, without being aggressive. And so assertiveness has come into its own. It is a very viable technique, not only for people who are in a business setting, who are in management and supervisory positions, but also a viable technique for people who seek therapy and counseling and so on. There's a whole body of research now that supports the value and the validity of assertiveness. Assertiveness is not just for the sake of spouting off. Assertiveness has some goals. And the goals of assertiveness are, and this is going to be a very important thing to remember as we go through the techniques of assertiveness. Assertiveness is for the purpose of teaching people how to treat us differently. If we don't like the treatment we get from others, if we are being attacked or accused, if people do treat us with disrespect, speaking up about oneself, speaking up and letting other people know how you would like to be treated is one of the major goals of assertiveness. People don't know how to treat you unless you let them know. Especially those of us who have allowed others to step on our toes, those of us who have allowed others to exploit us, not necessarily because they want to, but simply because they have asked us to do things and we have always said yes. We have never taken the initiative of saying no, and so we teach people how to treat us and we don't even know it. And assertiveness is a way of telling people that we want to be treated differently. The second goal of assertiveness is to increase your self-esteem. And that happens almost automatically. When you begin to stand up and speak out, you will start to feel more confident and you're going to like yourself a little bit better. Now, it's true that there is a little twinge of guilt when we first begin saying no to somebody we've always said yes to. And the only way we can get rid of that guilt is to keep doing it and to keep talking to ourselves and saying, it's all right. I'm going to let other people take care of themselves. I don't need to do that for them. And so the guilt eventually goes away if you just keep doing it, if you just keep speaking out. Your self-esteem will definitely increase. You're going to start feeling better for yourself, about yourself. The third goal is essentially to be a better communicator and to get things done through people. To be able to delegate, to be able to give them feedback, to tell them what they do well, to catch them doing something right, as we call it now, and to let them know what they have done right, and also to give them corrective feedback so that they can improve their performance. It's essentially a very honest and straightforward way of communicating with people. Now, the side benefits of that, as a powerful communicator, are that you will be seen as a leader, that people will quite often choose you for advancement because you are able to tell people what needs to be done, to set limits, and also to encourage them and to help them grow. There are some misconceptions that surround assertiveness, and I'd like to take care of those right now. One of the misconceptions is that assertiveness is a way of letting off steam, of spouting off, of telling people whatever is on my mind. That is not true. Assertiveness is always done for the purpose that I have just mentioned. Not just to get rid of some anger. There's some people out there who say, you've got to get it off your chest, otherwise you're going to get sick. There's very little evidence for that. We're not using assertiveness as a tool to let off steam and just tell people whatever is on my mind. Can you imagine what would happen if you did that? It's horrible for me to even think about. Imagine you would go out there and start telling people whatever is on your mind. Chances are you wouldn't live very long. There used to be, when assertiveness was going through its growing pains, there used to be some trainers who would go out and give people homework assignments. They would say, now, when you go to your party on Saturday afternoon or Saturday evening, just look for somebody whose tie you don't like. And then walk up to that person and say, you know what? That tie is awful. Now, I would like to know what the purpose of that is. You're not going to accomplish anything. Assertiveness is always geared and has a goal of some kind of change, not just for the sake of saying whatever goes through your mind. The second misconception is that we always get what we want when we are assertive. I wish that were true. I really wish that were true. I have not found that to be true myself, and neither has anybody else. It is true that assertiveness will increase the chances that we get what we want, because quite often we second guess what other people might think if we ask. We think, well, maybe they think it's unreasonable. Maybe they are not going to like me. Maybe I am being, too demanding. And so we don't ask at all, which is very unfortunate. Asking will increase the chances that you will get out of life what you want and what you need. But it doesn't guarantee it, because assertiveness is a two-way street. The other person also has a right to say no to us. The other person also has a right to stand up to us. And so success in assertiveness is not getting what you want, but rather the ability and the willingness to say something. The third misconception, and the hardest one to dispel, is the one that we find people do not give up easily, is that when I'm assertive, when I'm honest and straightforward with you, I'm going to hurt your feelings. I propose to you, ladies and gentlemen, that we do not have that kind of power. I don't have the power to hurt somebody else's feelings. That person has to allow that to happen. Eleanor Roosevelt made a very profound statement years ago. She said, "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." And you can put any word instead of inferior. No one can make you feel sad. No one can make you feel happy. No one can make you feel irritated or anything else unless you allow that to happen. And that's a crucial belief system in assertiveness, because a lot of us will not speak up for fear of hurting somebody else's feelings, because we're afraid to inflict some kind of psychological harm on another person. Now, there's no doubt that the more aggressive I am, the more I call you a dirty name, or I label you, or accuse you, or blame you aggressively, the greater are the chances that you're going to react with some kind of anger, possibly some kind of hurt. But even under those circumstances, can you say, I'm not going to let that bother me? We all have an influence on each other. There's no doubt about that. But the final decision always rests with the individual who is on the receiving end of that communication. You can call me some kind of name, and if your opinion doesn't count for me, or if I decide I have other things to do, I'm not going to be bothered by your comments, I make the final decision that it's not going to bother me. Now, what that entails, essentially, is that we as human beings need to consider that when we say something possibly unpleasant to somebody else, then we need not take care of the other person, but allow the other individual to do that for himself. An interesting thing happens when we try to read other people's minds or second guess them, and we don't say what we really want to say. There is an indirect message, a meta message, essentially, that means or says, you can't take care of yourself, and so I have to do it for you. And so I have to monitor everything that comes out of my mouth. I have to be very careful lest I say something that would hurt your feelings. And there's also the very interesting notion there that says I must be all-powerful, that I can hurt your feelings. I would like for you to consider that. I would like for you to think about that. That change in the belief system that so many of us hold takes a little bit of time. It does not happen overnight. As a matter of fact, I have found over years of practicing assertiveness that I still have to tell myself, I am not responsible for somebody else's feelings. It takes time. It really takes a little bit of work to get to the point of saying, I need to take care of myself. That does not mean I'm going to be selfish, but I need to take care of myself. I have a right to express myself, and I will allow the other person to choose however way he or she wants to feel about what I have said. Assertiveness means tactful, honest expressions of one's opinions and feelings. And when I am tactful to you and you still choose to feel upset, there is probably nothing that I can do about it. When I am faced with a difficult situation, I have three choices. One of them is to try and change the situation through speaking up, asking for what I want, refusing possibly to do something. The second choice is to accept the situation as it is. Because I've tried to make changes, didn't work, and so I'm going to learn to accept it. However, that entails some changes. The changes have to occur in your view, in your perception. I have to learn to say to myself, it isn't that bad. I can stand it. It's okay. I can live with it. And there's only one other choice you have. What is that? Leave. That's it. Leave. There is nothing else. Now, most of us, if we have been dealing with somebody over a long period of time, and we have tried and tried and tried, and it hasn't made a dent, it hasn't made any difference, we'll probably give up. And when we give up depends on our own endurance and persistence. It's very, very important for those of us who have learned to take care of other people's emotions, other people's feelings, to change that belief system, because it will contribute to our assertiveness. If we don't change it, chances are we will revert back or maintain our non-assertiveness. Not saying what we want to say, not speaking up for ourselves, because we're always thinking, wonder how the other person is going to react to that. Now, there is a flip side to that belief system. One side is, I don't want to hurt the other person's feelings. And the flip side of that is, I might be rejected. As a matter of fact, it's even worse. We predict that we will be rejected. They won't like me anymore, or they're going to do some kind of harm to me. If I make them mad, they're going to hurt me. Now, there are some people in the world who will do that. And I would be less than honest if I told you, just go ahead and say, you know, if you want to stand up for yourself, do it. Nobody's going to hurt you. That's not true. There are some people who will retaliate. And the more power they have, obviously, the more aggressive they are, the greater are the chances that they will retaliate. Now, here's the key. How do we make a choice when to assert ourselves and when not? Always base your decision on past experience. The best predictor we have of human behavior is what people have done in the past. The best predictor. Not just what you have done in the past, what the other person has done in the past, what other people have done in their relationship with that individual. So if you're dealing with a powerful boss, let's say, and you have been on the receiving end of mistreatment, disrespect, and you say to yourself, I'm not going to take this anymore. I like my job, so I don't want to leave, but I'm going to start speaking up about it. Before you do so, find out what other people have done. Chances are, if you start looking, you'll find one or two or several people who are perfectly assertive with that difficult boss, and nothing ever happens to them. And then, if that is the case, you base your decision on that past experience. If they have done it, chances are you can do it too. Don't base your decision on fear, because that is exactly what all of us have done on occasion. We think we have an irrational fear. We do a lot of irrational thinking. We say, well, things are going to be awful and terrible, and I shouldn't take that chance because something terrible is going to happen to me. And it's not based on reality. It's not based on fact. It's something that we have learned as we grew up. One of the things, for instance, that I learned is, what are people going to think about you? You must not make waves. You must not say, you know, don't be rude. Rudeness was confused with assertiveness and standing up for yourself. And so you must not do that because what are people going to think about you? I remember when I was a little kid, my mother used to say to me when we were out in public and she wanted to control my behavior, she would always say to me, see that man over there? See that? If you don't behave yourself, what do you think he's going to think about you? Now, she never told me what he might think about me. And so I had to probably made up all kinds of stories in my mind, right? Oh, he's going to think terrible things about me. And do you know that still today, when I walk into a hotel and I don't get good treatment, they're rude to me, or somebody steps in line in front of me, before I speak up, I will turn around to see who is behind me And what that person looks like is it that man that my mother pointed to when I was a kid. That stuff follows you throughout your life. And it really has a profound effect on our behavior. And so part of learning to be assertive is examining some of those beliefs, some of that, what we call conditioned emotional response, some of that anxiety, some of the fear that we carry into adulthood. What are people going to think about me? Well, who cares? What I really would like to point out to you is that assertiveness is very situational. So is passive behavior, not saying what you want to say. So is aggressive behavior. We tend to be, all of us tend to be aggressive when we are tired, when we are hungry, when we are in crowded places, and that includes feeling a lot of stress, being crowded time-wise, and also when we find ourselves in noisy situations. Those are conditions that are more likely to elicit some aggressive response in us. Quite often people will say to me, you know, I feel like a schizophrenic. The reason that is because you're probably a different person at work than you are at home. You act differently according to the situation and according to changes in the situations in which you find yourself. You will respond differently from one person to another. When we do studies and do research, asking both men and women how they react to conflict situations in their work setting, what we find is that both men and women report leaning toward the passive side. I'm not going to say anything. Are you kidding? I don't want people to make decisions about me that are based on anger. I don't want people to retaliate. I don't want to get the shaft because I have spoken up about something that bothers me in the work setting. So what they do essentially is put a lid on their feelings in the work setting. We tend not to be quite as honest as we would like to be in the work setting. Now that doesn't mean we don't experience frustration, irritation, and so on. What do we do with those feelings? We save them for the ones we love. We take them home. Both genders tend to be physically aggressive. As a matter of fact, women batter too. They don't usually make physical contact, though. They don't usually take a fist and punch their spouses. What we do instead is throw things.
This is the end of Tape 1, Side A of Assertiveness Training. Please fast forward this cassette to the end and turn it over to hear Helga talk more about aggression and passivity and the difference between males and females. This is Tape 1, Side B of Assertiveness Training with Helga Rhode.
Now with strangers, men are more likely to be assertive, women are more likely to be passive. When we're out in the world and we're dealing with people we don't know, part of the man's socialization says, you've got to stand up for yourself, otherwise you don't look like a man, you don't feel like a man. Women, on the other hand, deal with difficult situations in public through appeasement, trying to get people to back down and be nice. We're nice. But what do we do with the feelings that we collect as a result of being nice to somebody who is rude to us? We go home and we let it all hang out. So one thing to remember about assertiveness is that it is situational. Don't think of it as, that's just me. I'm a passive person and there's nothing I can do about it. Which brings me to the second point. Assertiveness or passive communication or aggressive communication is really a learned behavior. You don't come into the world just being an aggressive individual. There are some gender differences, however. We think men tend to be slightly more aggressive than women. But those differences are modified by our learning history, by what the messages that we get, modified by the environment in which we grow up. The messages that we get from our parents and teachers, from those significant other people in our lives, do have an effect on how we handle other people as adults. There's just no doubt about it. When somebody says to you as you're growing up, don't say anything unless you have something nice to say, especially if you get punished when you start saying things that are honest and straightforward, chances are as an adult you're not going to do that. Also, watching, observing how our parents handle conflict. Do they talk up to people? Do they say something to a stranger? Do they talk directly face-to-face to people with whom they are displeased? Or do they wait until the individual has left and then talk about them behind their backs? Those are all things we learn very early in life and have a tendency to imitate as we grow up and as adults. Some of us decide, especially if we have grown up in an environment that is highly combative, we may decide we're never going to do that as long as we live. And so we tend to diffuse conflict. We tend to say, I'm not going to make waves. I don't want to hear anybody scream and yell. So those two things, remember them. Your communication style is situational. It's not because there's something wrong with you, but rather that's normal. Everybody reacts differently to different situations. And secondly, how you communicate and how you relate to people is a learned behavior. And what is learned can be unlearned. And I think therein lies a great deal of optimism. Always remember you can change it. You can do something about it. It's not because it's part of your personality and you can't rip it out or do something about it. Yes, you can. Let's look at the three communication styles in turn to examine what we mean by passive, what passive people do, and essentially give you a definition and a clear understanding of what those behavior styles are. We typically refer to passive behavior not as behavior that just means sitting someplace not doing anything, but rather as people-pleasing behavior. Doesn't mean I don't talk at all. What it means is that I say things that I may not want to say, and I say them for the purpose of pleasing other people. I say them for the purpose of not being rejected. I say them for the purpose so that people will like me. And I find myself, as a passive individual, I find myself saying things that I really don't want to say. In some cases, I may not say anything, either because I'm afraid of retaliation, or because I think it's rude, or because I am just tongue-tied and I can't think straight. Now, when we ask passive people how they feel, when they say things that they really don't want to say, possibly say yes when they want to say no, they will quite often report feeling like a wimp. Say, I feel like a doormat. People can ask me to do things I don't really want to do. And I don't know why I say yes. I just do. And in the process, quite often, people ask us to do incredible things. Because they know the easiest person to go to get something done is the passive individual. If you find yourself being asked by people to serve on committees over and over again, and you've got it up to your neck, you don't want to do it anymore, chances are the reason they come to you is because you always say yes. Or you say, well, I really don't have much time and got a lot of other things going in my life. They put a little bit of pressure on you, sure enough, especially if they push your guilt button. And then you say, sure, okay, all right, I'll do it. Is there anything else I can do for you? When we examine the communication style of passive people, here's what we find. Overly apologetic. It stands to reason, if I'm going to be a people pleaser, that I also have to be very, very polite and very, very apologetic. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so terribly sorry. I just can't seem to understand how you want me to design this layout. I feel really bad that I couldn't figure it out. In the process, they quite often put themselves down, hoping that no criticism will be forthcoming. If I'm very apologetic and I say, gosh, you know, I'm stupid, I'm dumb, what can I do about it? Chances are you're not going to clobber me. You're not going to say anything nasty to me. Another thing that we find is communication that suggests and actually transmits some kind of helpless feeling, or what is sometimes called a victim syndrome. It won't matter what I say because you're going to make up your own minds anyway. There's a little bit of manipulation in that, isn't there? Very much so. If I say to you, look, what difference does it make if I tell you I want to do it another way because you're going to do it your way anyway? What I'm transmitting is not just that I can't do anything about the situation, but I'm also hoping that you will feel a little bit guilty and maybe search your conscience a little bit and say to me, now wait a minute, you know, if it's not right for you, we'll change it. There is an element of I'm being abused by others and I am a victim. Helplessness has become a very interesting and extensively studied area in psychology because we have found that when people feel helpless, they often become depressed. That is why you have heard how important it is to allow people some control over their environment, some control over their jobs. One of the things that Peters and Waterman found in their studies of excellent companies is that excellent companies allow their employees some autonomy to own a piece of the action. And the reason that has become an important factor is because when people feel helpless, they get depressed. When they have some control, when they can do something and have say-so about their environment, they feel happier, they feel more in charge. They feel more powerful. And so helplessness has become a very important area. And studies have shown, there have been a number of studies that have used a variety of subjects. We've used dogs to study helplessness. We've also used human subjects to study helplessness. People, for instance, have been given in research studies impossible tasks to solve. Human subjects have been put into conditions of loud noise which they couldn't escape. And what the researchers have found is that over trials, people, perfectly happy, normal, self-controlled people, will learn how to feel helpless. They'll give up. They'll say, there's nothing I can do about it. Now, the thing that is interesting and probably very important to remember is that learned helplessness is not based on reality. In other words, they could control the environment. But if they have learned to feel helpless, they give up and they never try again. And that's right often what we find with passive people. They start to believe that it doesn't matter. Why should I even try? It's not going to make a difference. And when they believe that, it becomes reality for them and they become totally ineffective. And I believe all of us have learned some helplessness. And it becomes a matter of examining, where do I give up too easily? Maybe I need to persist. Maybe I have just learned that I don't have an effect on my environment. And so you have to essentially make yourself jump over the barrier of that learned helplessness in order to find out that, yes, indeed, you can have an influence on your environment. You can have an influence on people. That what you say can make a difference. Another thing that we find with passive people is that they tend toward manipulation. Examine this statement. Well, I guess it's okay. I'll have to miss my doctor's appointment that I've had scheduled for a month. But if that's when you want to meet, I'll do it. What do you hear? You hear that manipulation of guilt? I hope that you feel guilty enough because you scheduled the meeting when I couldn't do it. Now, I'm not going to ask you directly to change it because that wouldn't be a people-pleasing behavior. I don't want to be I don't want you to see me as a difficult person. And so I do it indirectly. I hope that you feel guilty enough and say to me, well, not just a minute. I mean, we don't want you to miss your doctor's appointment. We'll change the meeting. It's a very indirect way of communicating. Another descriptor of a passive communication is tentative. We say that people who are passive are tentative in their approaches toward others. We see that in the work setting a lot. We see it with bosses who don't know how to delegate directly. They'll approach somebody and say, do you think, may I interrupt you for a minute? I know you're awfully busy, or just let me know when I can talk to you, but I've got this work to do. Well, now let me see. I've got, gee, I hope you don't mind, but I've got this report that needs to be typed. Do you think you might be able to do it? I sort of need it by tomorrow afternoon, but I just want you to know, I don't want to put some pressure on you. I would just like, I sort of need it. Do you think maybe you can do it? A lot of tentative language, a lot of conditional language, not very powerful. Then people who talk that way wonder why it is that other folks' work is getting done before theirs. It's because they don't speak directly. It's always tiptoeing around you. I don't want you to get mad at me. I want you to think I'm a nice person, you see. And so I approach you in a very tentative kind of fashion. When you're on the receiving end of that kind of communication, you get very impatient, don't you? You say, just give it to me, just tell me, I'll do it, or I'll tell you I can't do it, but just say what you want to say. And another way in which we can describe passive verbal communication is to call it ambiguous. They talk out of both sides of their mouth. Oh, I agree with you completely. However, I think we should do it another way. And you go, huh? Which way is it? Okay. Now, it's actually not hard to identify passive people's communication if you think of it as people-pleasing. If you think of it as tiptoeing around people and saying, I don't have to be overly polite, overly apologetic, don't want to hurt anybody else's feelings. And please remember that I said when we do that, we are sending an indirect message that says, you can't take care of yourself, I've got to do it for you. There are some nonverbal components to this passive way of communicating, but not always. Sometimes people are so good at putting up a facade. I know some people who are essentially passive. Nobody knows it but they. They know it because they know that they are saying yes when they really want to say no. But they are so good at putting on a facade and appearing to be honest that we, those of us who are listeners and receivers of that communication, have no idea that they're saying yes when they want to say no. However, we quite often see some nonverbal behavior that looks passive. Nonverbal behavior accounts for 55% of the communication process. That is, facial expressions, body posture, what we do with our hands, how we relate to other people in terms of space. 55% of the communication process is comprised of those nonverbals. Tone of voice, 38%. And the rest, which is the verbal communication, 7%. Now, what is it that passive people sometimes do? That we can tell by their body posture, we can tell in the way they approach us that they are essentially passive people. Quite often a bearing that looks apologetic. They almost look like they are an accident in the world. Hey? Please, Lord, forgive me. What can I do? I'm here, right? And so they move with a certain timidity. They say, look, they don't look confident. They don't look powerful. They look apologetic in their approach toward others. They always give off messages that say, I don't want to infringe on your time. I hope that you don't think of me as being too intrusive. I hope that you still like me. So I'm going to be very careful. Quite often, a bowed head. Facial expressions sometimes that suggest anxiety. Fidgeting with their faces. Not good eye contact. They do what we call furtive looking. Furtive looking essentially means I don't look at you straight on. I look at something in the environment and then I quickly check out your facial expressions. I dart with my eyes. I quickly look at your face and then I look away again and then quickly check it out again in order to see whether you still like me or not, you see. Tone of voice can be soft, weak. They don't project their voices very easily. Halting speech, a lot of ahs and ohs. Delayed responses. They don't have a certain spontaneity about them. Quite often there is fidgeting. In other words, transmitting non-verbally their anxiousness, their tenseness, and so on. They'll fidget with their hands, do a variety of things that suggest that they're not feeling comfortable in the presence of others. So those are some of the indicators of passive behavior. What do you think the effects are of passive behavior in the work environment? Lack of productivity. If I am not firm and straightforward in my delegation, chances are you're going to get confused and you won't get the work done. Frustration. Dealing with somebody who is not willing to give you a straightforward opinion, express his or her thoughts straightforwardly. So you try and second guess a great deal, and you get frustrated by that. Lack of feedback. Passive people quite often do not give compliments to others because they are afraid other people might think they want something. They may give compliments. As a matter of fact, it could be the opposite. They may say, walk around their employees and say, you're wonderful, you're great, you're absolutely fantastic. And then comes evaluation time, performance review time, and they've got to say something. They've got to say something because maybe the employee's advancement, increase in salary is dependent on their performance. And so they say, I've got to say something. And so they hem and haw around. Now, the employee will not know where that criticism that is forthcoming at performance review time, where that came from. Where did it all start? My boss said I was doing fine. For 6 months, for a whole year, my boss said, just keep on doing. You're okay. Never told me I was not doing things well. And now, he or she tells me I haven't been doing so well. Has enormous ramifications for the growth of employees. Has enormous ramifications for people's lives. Tremendous impact on people's lives. Bosses who cannot tell people when they do something right, who cannot tell people when they do something wrong, are not helping their employees. And there's just no doubt about that. If I have a choice, and mind you, I really am not one of those people who says, please criticize me. I love it. Give me more criticism. And I don't know of anybody who does that. We're all sensitive to criticism. But if I have my choice, and if I'm serious about advancing in my job, I want to get ahead, I really would like to grow and learn, I will always pick a boss who is willing to say to me, you did this right, you did this wrong. You've got to improve over here, because that helps me. In the final analysis, that's a gift. And passive people don't do that. Now, I need to point out to you what the advantages are of being passive, because none of us do anything unless there's something in it for us. The payoff is immediate. Next time you find yourself in a situation and you say, gosh, I really ought to say something, but I don't want to, and you decide to delay speaking up, you decide, I'm not going to tell my employee that they need to shape up. You put it off. Watch what happens to your anxiety. The anxiety that goes along with saying, I've got to say something. And you say to yourself, I'm not going to do it now. I'll do it some other time, not now. Something happens to your anxiety. Your body, as a matter of fact, is going to go, thank God I don't have to do it now. It's exactly what we do when we procrastinate. And that is a short-range reward for not being assertive. That is a short-range reward for being passive and non-assertive. And so the advantages, the payoffs, are always short-range avoidance of guilt, avoidance of fear, or anxiety. And I think it's very important to know that, because that's the hurdle you have to jump over. That is the hurdle that you have to jump over. And say to yourself, okay, may not be pleasant right now, but I'm going to do it. And the more you do it, the more desensitized you become to that possible guilt or fear, the easier it gets. Okay, so keep that in mind. because that short-range advantage will quite often leave you in a non-assertive posture. And you've got to jump over that. Say, okay, so fine. So at first I'm going to feel a little bit guilty, but so what? It'll go away. Helga Rhode said it'll go away. I promise you it will. The disadvantages are long range. The disadvantages are profound. The disadvantages are high stress because you don't like yourself. When people abuse you and you don't do anything about it, high stress because you hate yourself. As a matter of fact, we say that passive people find themselves in a double bind. A double bind is being damned if you do and damned if you don't. And passive people's double bind is when I say no, I feel guilty, and when I say yes, I hate myself. So they're losers either way. Another disadvantage is not being chosen for advancement. Quite often, the more passive you are, the less likely it is that you will be advanced. You are not seen as a leader. And people, employees themselves, do not choose those kinds of bosses. They don't want to be with that kind of boss. And if any of you have that kind of boss, you know very well what I'm talking about. They may be pleasant to be around. They never say anything nasty. But in the long run, they don't help you at all. And so passive people never really accomplish the goal of helping people grow, of getting results through people, and at the same time, they do not accomplish the goal of teaching others how they want to be treated.
This is the end of Tape 1, Side B of Assertiveness Training with Dr. Helga Rhode. Now insert the next cassette and listen to Tape 2, Side A. This is Tape 2, Side A of Assertiveness Training by Dr. Helga Rhode.
What about aggressive behavior? Let's switch now and look at the other extreme of this communication style. Passive means I don't say what I want to say. Aggressive people have no such problems. We define aggression very differently than we do in the work setting. In assertiveness training, aggressiveness means bullying behavior. In the business world, we quite often think of it as go-getting behavior. Companies advertise for, I want to have a salesman who is a go-getter, who is aggressive, who goes out there and beats the bushes and gets the business. Please keep that distinction in mind. The meaning of the word aggression in assertiveness training is very negative. It does not have any positive connotations. Essentially, it means bullying, telling people off, being difficult to work with. Aggression, if we wanted to give it a formal definition, is standing up for yourself in such a way that the rights of the other person are violated. It's an attempt to humiliate, control, and the word control is very important. Punish or put down the other person. To my mind, there are three types of aggressive people in the work setting or in the home setting. The first one of them is what I call the should person. That's the individual who goes around telling people what they should or shouldn't have done, or what they should or shouldn't do. They operate from a set of rules that quite often only they know. The set of rules is in their heads. They have all kinds of rules by which they think other people ought to abide. And when you don't, and then they come down real hard on you. They quite often have a very short fuse. They have what we call under-controlled anger. They don't control their emotions very easily. They nitpick quite a bit. And they come after you every chance they get. If you just do a little bit of something that they don't approve of, they'll let you know about it. There's no way you have to second-guess these people. A psychologist by the name of Arnold Lazarus says, people like that, people who use shoulds a lot and give other people directives, use authoritarian ways of dealing with people, quite dictatorial in their approach, are really just shoulding upon others. Any of you have a parent like that? How about a boss? Have you ever experienced a boss like that? Yes. What do you typically do with people like that? What do you do with a boss like that? So, and you come back strong. You become aggressive in return. That is quite often the kind of behavior that they elicit from other people. When they start nitpicking and they start saying should, you should have, and shouldn't have, one of two things can happen. Well, actually, one of three things can happen. Either I back down and I do what they want me to do, or I become defensive in return. I try to justify myself, or I use the same technique. I become aggressive back. Say, look who's talking. Okay. The second type of individual is what we call the ex-manager. Not ex as in ex-wife or ex-husband, but rather XYZ. McGregor formulated the concept of the ex-manager and the Y-manager. Some of you are, I'm sure, familiar with that. He says the Y-manager is the individual who essentially believes that people are good. They come into the world wanting to do good work, and they're motivated, and they're self-motivated. And all you really have to do is hold up a carrot and give them an incentive, and they will just go and give you all the results that you want. The ex-manager is the opposite of that. The ex-manager essentially is an individual who believes that people are basically bad and basically lazy. And so what we have to do in order to motivate people is to hold threats over their head. We have to try and intimidate them. We have to make sure that they don't think that, you know, we're soft managers, that we can be exploited, and we have to keep their adrenaline flowing as much as possible so that we can get the work done. And the way I do that is to never notice when you're doing something right. I'll point out your mistakes so that you will repent and do better in the future. Ken Blanchard, who wrote The 1-Minute Manager, calls that the leave-alone zap method of managing. We leave people alone when they do a good job, but as soon as they make a mistake, we zap them. It is also called the Nihisab game. Now I have you, you SOB. The third type of aggressive individual that we see in the work setting, in the home setting, out in public, doesn't matter what the situation, is called the gunny sacker. Now guess who the gunny sacker is? The normal neurotic. That's you and me and all the other people that you know. The gunny sacker is the individual who is typically non-assertive, collects grievances, doesn't do anything about them at the time, smiles toward the individual who has caused him grief, and then just, one rainy day when he or she has collected enough grievances, dumps the whole thing. That's the gunny sacker. That's what we call gunny sacking. Essentially saving up your insults and the things that you were unhappy about, filing them away in your memory bank. Don't do anything about them right here and now, but file them away in your memory bank. And then, someday when you are in a bad mood, you're going to bring them all out. You're going to retrieve them. We call that cashing them in. Okay? We cash them in. Now, behavior like that is very hard to deal with, even though all of us engage in it in a sense. For those of us on the receiving end, we have no indication that the person is irritated or that the person is mad at us in some way, because they're always going around smiling at us. When we do something wrong, they don't tell us. They just smile. They just say, no, it's all right, nothing wrong, no. And sometimes we even suspect that we've done something that was displeasing to them. We say, is it okay? I mean, is it all right? Oh yeah, nothing's wrong. They always put the smile on their face. Now, quite often, they send a mixed message by doing that. But we don't know. See, what we do, since nonverbal communication is so much more important, we pay attention to their smiles. And we think, well, probably is okay. I had a young woman come to me in my private practice some years ago. And she said, I have a criminal personality. So I sat by the door, made sure that I had a quick exit. And I said to her, what did you do? She said, well, there's this woman in my work environment, and I just can't stand working with this woman. I've been working with her for 2 years, and she's one of those nosy, intrusive individuals. She'll run up to me and interrupt me when I have a conversation with somebody. She'll just interrupt. Or if I want to go to lunch with some of my friends, she'll just come along. Nobody asked her. She'll just join our group. And she has a variety of such intrusive behaviors. And she said, the other day I was standing talking to some of my coworkers. We were trying to decide where to go to lunch. And I said, I could see her coming already. She said, she came, joined the group, nobody asked her, and she said, I think we ought to go to McDonald's. And she said, I didn't even think. I didn't even give it a second thought. I turned around and smacked her right in the mouth. I said, for heaven's sake, 2 years you have been tolerating this, you never said anything, you only smiled at her when she did that? It would have been so easy for you to turn to her real quickly, spontaneously, and say, please don't interrupt me. No, I'd like to go to lunch with my friends. I'll see you later. Why didn't you do it? She said, I didn't want to hurt her feelings. Okay? Now, the woman who got smacked didn't know for 2 years that my client was unhappy with her behavior, because she smiled always. What can you do? That's the way it is. There was another young woman who approached me. She was attending at one of my seminars, and she said, I don't know how I can teach the men in my office not to pinch my behind. I said, in this day and age, that doesn't happen. I can't imagine. She said, well, I've tried all kinds of things, but they won't stop. So when I'm standing in the elevator and I'm facing the door, if those guys, I get along with them all right, but when they're standing right behind me, they'll sneak a pinch. And I said, well, what do you say to them? She said, well, I tell them to stop. I said, show me, show me. She said, well, I'll just turn around and toss my head and say, quit it. With a huge smile on her face and a cute voice, all right? Now, what was she doing? She was sending them a message that said, hey, you guys, I really like it. Isn't that right? All right. No wonder they continue to do it. That is quite often what gunny sackers will do. On the one hand, they don't say anything. They'll smile, and thereby quite often send a mixed message. They won't say anything. Or they'll say it in such a way that people don't get the message, and then they get more and more and more angry until one day it becomes a serious problem. Essentially, it becomes the straw that breaks the camel's back. And all of us have a tendency to do that. Next time you have an argument with your spouse, examine what you say to your spouse. Chances are you will drag in garbage from a long time ago. Remember what you did 10 years ago? Okay. Of course the person doesn't remember. Okay. So that is the third type of aggressive behavior. That's when we have temper tantrums. That's quite often when we say things that we later very much regret. Think of how the last time you had an argument with your spouse. Did you approach your spouse and say, honey, I am very angry because you did such and such? Chances are you didn't say any such thing. You said, you make me so mad. Isn't that true? So you blame the other person. That's exactly how we define aggressive behavior. Using you messages. Blaming means I use you messages. You make me unhappy. You make me angry. You are the cause of my discomfort. When I say to somebody, you make me mad, what am I essentially saying? Think about that for a minute. What am I essentially saying? Who has control over my feelings? Who has control? The other person does. The other person does. If I say you make me mad, I'm essentially saying you have control over my feelings. It's not a true statement, number one. And secondly, in a sense, it sounds rather powerless. But most of us who talk that way don't even realize it. Now, nonverbals that go along with that kind of behavior are very overt, very explicit. Body posture that is quite often pompous. And you can add the three-letter word that goes along with that. It is quite often intrusive. What aggressive people tend to do is step into your body space. Have you ever noticed that? They come way too close. You tend to do that too with your children. Think of the last time you scolded one of your kids. Do you have children? Do you have teenagers? Teenagers are psychotic. Psychotic, by definition, means out of touch with reality. There is a sign that says, hire teenagers while they still know everything. When you get mad at your teenager or you get mad at your children, you tend to step into their body space, very close to them, raise your finger, poke it in their eyes, and say, don't you ever do that again. Isn't that true? Now, grown-ups have a tendency to do that to each other, too, except not quite that close, because we're usually afraid somebody's going to clobber us. But we see versions of that kind of invasion of your body space. We also see facial expressions that look angry, frowns, a lot of tension in the face, eye contact that is not eye contact as paying attention, eye contact that says, I want to listen to what you have to say, but rather the evil eye. I look right through you. I look at you in a threatening kind of fashion. Watch the facial expressions of an angry person or someone, at least who pretends to be angry. Sometimes aggressive people just pretend to be angry. And you will see a lot of tension in their faces. You will also see a lot of tension in their bodies. As a matter of fact, that is exactly what happens when we are upset, when we're angry. We tense up our muscles. And quite often our blood pressure goes up also. You will see the jaws working sometimes. You will see them gnashing their teeth. Those of you who have aggressive parents, one or the other of the parents, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Their tone of voice quite often is loud. Their tone of voice has a cutting edge to it. It is hostile sounding. And most of us will either react through flight behavior or fight behavior. Those are the two behaviors that we quite often talk about when we're talking about stress, when we're talking about some kind of present and immediate danger. And so we react in that fashion. Very difficult to deal with such a person. Whether that's a gunny sacker having a temper tantrum, or whether that's the ex-manager who uses that as a style of managing people, or whether that's somebody who's just a nitpicker, a very dictatorial person. Now, here is the interesting thing. When we use that way, that kind of behavior, in order to control other people. Essentially, that is what we want to do. I want to control you. Otherwise, I wouldn't use that kind of communication. While I'm doing it, I am probably not feeling very powerful. I may seem to myself as being powerful because I am acting in aggressive, loud fashion, domineering fashion. But essentially, I would not feel the need to use aggression if I were powerful. If I could easily influence you by saying, would you please do this for me? And you would do it, I wouldn't feel the need to yell at you. And I would be in charge. I could influence you. I would have power. I would have some control. But the fact that I have to yell and scream and threaten you means that I'm afraid I'm not going to get what I want. Think of the last time you yelled at your kids. You start yelling more and more and more. You yelled because they didn't give you what you wanted, and so you were essentially not controlling the situation. And you didn't feel powerful until you got what you wanted, until you made them do it. And the same thing is true of people in the work environment. When they feel the need to lash out and to threaten others, it's not because they feel so powerful. It's because they are afraid they're not going to be able to get what they want. Now, some people do that over years of practice. They develop a style, and they don't even think about it anymore. But quite often, people say to me, isn't it true that people who are aggressive really feel intimidated, really feel anxious, really feel insecure internally? Oh, yes, that may very well be the case. Otherwise, they wouldn't feel the need to use those tactics in order to control other people. But not all of them. After a while, when it becomes a habit, people don't experience any feeling of insecurity. And I'm sure that there are lots of people who are well regarded in our society, who are heads of corporations and so on, who have developed that style of getting people to do what they want them to do, and they're not feeling insecure in any way at all. It becomes a habit, essentially. Now, once I can make people do what I want them to do because I threaten them enough, because I hold a stick over their heads, I do feel powerful. I feel that I have control over others, that I can make them do things. What I do not know, however, is that there is a tremendous disadvantage. See, I have an illusion that for now, right now, I can get results. People comply. If I can scare them enough, they'll comply. And so I have an illusion that what I do works. And I use it again and again and again, but it only works in the short run. What I do not know as an aggressor is that people do not commit. They don't commit to me, nor to their jobs. They don't. They'll do whatever is required just to get me off their backs, but they will not give me commitment. There's a cute story that illustrates the difference between compliance and commitment. There was a father at a gathering of people with his little daughter, Jennifer, and Jennifer was running around disturbing everybody, and so her father said, Jennifer, I'd like for you to go sit down. And Jennifer, of course, wasn't having any of it. She said, no, Daddy, I can't. And so he became increasingly coercive, and he said, I said, sit down, and she still was not obeying. So finally, he picked her up, and he put her in the chair, and he said, I'll show you you can sit. She looked up at him, and she said, Daddy, on the outside, I am sitting down, but on the inside, I'm still running around. And that's exactly what grown-ups will do. If you chew out a grown-up and you threaten an adult, they will not think about their work and how creative can I be and how innovative can I be. They don't say, God, what a wonderful place I work in. What they do is run around in their minds, and what do they think about? What's your guess? How to get even, how to get back. Haven't you ever found yourself fantasizing about how you're going to hurt somebody who has hurt you? Of course. Do you know, it used to be, before we started really emphasizing the importance of complimenting and praising people, when it was a given that we managed people through the use of threats and punishment, we used to say to managers and supervisors, if you have to criticize an employee, if you have to chew them out, Never do it in the morning. Why do you think that is?
You lose them for the whole day.
Because you lose them for the whole day. They'll look busy, right? They'll do whatever is required just so they don't get chewed out again. But they'll do it without any kind of devotion or commitment, because what they're doing in their heads is running around and thinking about the kind of treatment they got and how bad it is, and am I going to leave this job, and where can I find another one, and all that kind of stuff. And so the advice we used to give people, managers, is to say, chew them out at the end of the workday so they can fret on their own time. And quite often, the aggressor doesn't know that his or her employees are actually sabotaging him. Because sometimes the sabotage, you don't know who did it. Sometimes it is totally covert. When my brother was in college, we lived in Chicago, and he worked at a fast food restaurant. He said one day a customer walked in, sat down at the counter, and said to the guy behind the counter, "One hamburger and step on it, Dumbo." He got a stepped-on hamburger. Now, those are humorous ways of getting back at people. There are also some very serious ways. Of course, I'm not suggesting that there aren't people out in the environment who will do harm to their organizations without being treated aggressively. There are some people who have no good intentions for their employers for whatever reason, but you will increase the chances of sabotage if you treat people in an abusive fashion, if you step on their toes, if you deny them the basic human rights, which essentially means treating them with respect. There are many other disadvantages that have been identified through very good empirical research. Disadvantages that derive from using punishment as a way of getting people to do what we want them to do, such as people not wanting to be around us. We become an aversive stimulus to other people. When I use aggression and threats, and you might remember that, those of you who tend to be aggressive with your children, we become an aversive stimulus to them. They don't want to be around us. They turn the corner when they see us coming. The person and the behavior start to become associated with each other. That is why, when you were little, if you had an aggressive parent, you were always watching your parents' facial expressions in order to be able to predict what they're going to do. Any of you do that? We knew as children to look at our father's face. And when he had a frown on his face, we ran the other way as quickly as possible. Now, one thing we also learned was that if he did scold us, if he did treat us aggressively, that he would probably feel very remorseful later on. And so if we wanted something, we would always wait until the guilt overcame him. Okay. Now, what about assertiveness? Assertiveness is in the middle. We have talked about passive behavior as one end of a continuum, aggression as being on the other end of a continuum of communication styles. Assertiveness is in the middle. Assertiveness, however, is flexible. Assertiveness is not just a skill that we can very easily describe and put limits around. We can't say this word is assertive, this word is not assertive, but rather look at assertiveness as a flexible style. You still need to be able to judge yourself when a certain expression, a certain sentence, a certain word is appropriate with a certain individual. And so essentially what I'm saying to you is that flexibility and social judgment are still required for an assertive individual. Think of it this way. When I am dealing with an individual who is very sensitive, I know from past experience, all I have to say to that individual is, would you please come into my office? And the person goes, what have I done wrong? Okay. You already know from past experience you're dealing with somebody like that. You might want to step a little bit more lightly. I'm not saying tiptoe around the person. I'm not saying being dishonest. But approaching them, possibly with a gentler tone of voice, making sure that your face looks kinder, that kind of thing. So you move a little bit toward the more passive side, never to the extreme. With another individual, you might choose to be a little bit more firm, a little stronger in your approach, a little more to the aggressive side. Let's suppose you have an employee. You have said to that employee, please do not smoke around the dynamite. And the individual just hasn't heard. They're not complying. Well, with that kind of individual, you don't want to say 2, 3, 4 times, would you please not smoke around the explosives? Okay? What you might want to do is to say, look, this is it. Here are the consequences. If you do that one more time, I'm going to transfer you to another department, or I'm going to let you go. In other words, you invoke some consequences. Don't see that as a threat. Just say, and save it as a last resort. But with some individuals, you'll have to say, here are the consequences. And it's up to you whether you want me to employ those consequences or not. So assertiveness is a whole range of behaviors, as long as you remember the crucial elements. Assertiveness is not stepping on other people's toes. It is essentially saying what you want to say, insisting on your rights, standing up, speaking out without infringing on the rights of other people.
This is the end of Tape 2, Side A of Assertiveness Training by Dr. Helga Rhode. Please fast forward this cassette to the end and turn it over to listen to the other side. Tape 2, Side B is where Helga talks about tactful honesty. This is Tape 2, Side B of Assertiveness Training by Dr. Helga Rhode.
The communication of assertive people is essentially tactfully honest. If we are tactfully honest, we can usually get our point across and minimize the chances that people will react back to us with hostility or with some kind of hurt feeling. A humorous definition of tact is telling somebody to go to hell and making them look forward to the trip. Just joking. Being honest, telling you what's on my mind, expressing myself, requesting what I need, refusing unreasonable requests. Tactfully honest by not stepping on your toes, not accusing you, not blaming you, not pointing my finger, but rather expressing my own feelings and opinions, using ownership. So tactfully honest essentially is expressing and requesting, asking for what I need or want from you, and refusing what's not good for me or something that I consider to be unreasonable. Something that you might be able to do for yourself, Essentially a refusal to be abused and exploited by people, refusing disrespectful treatment. It is also direct communication. Being straightforward in my approach, not beating around the bush, not using excessive verbiage, but rather expressing myself directly. It's also called clear communication. Using I statements, which essentially suggest ownership. If you think of the you statements that aggressive people use, fixing the blame, saying you are responsible for my discomfort, assertive people will claim ownership. They'll say, I react this way. I get mad, I get frustrated, I am unhappy, I am impatient when you do such and such. That transmits information, but at the same time, I'm not blaming you for it. I'm saying this is how I feel, this is how I react to what you're doing. Not only is it easier to tell people unpleasant things when you talk that way, but it's far easier for the recipient of your communication to hear it. Far easier. So iMessages are one of the hallmarks of assertive communication. And if you do nothing else after you listen to this program, but start using iMessages instead of you messages, you will have made a significant change in your life. Significant change in your life. Something happens when we begin to take ownership of our own opinions and feelings and refrain from fixing blame on others. We start feeling more powerful and also have the illusion, not the illusion, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. When you begin to use iMessages and own your own opinions and feelings, you will begin to realize that you have power. You have the power to change your own reactions to what happens in the world. We call that also, when we talk to people and say, I am unhappy when you do such and such, we call that being responsibly confrontive. I can confront you, and it's not going to be nearly as unpleasant if I tell you that it's I who react in this fashion. Confrontive, okay. Essentially, what that means is telling another person, here's how I see things, I'll have my say, and then I will listen to what you have to say. And it's always a two-way street. Assertive people realize that assertiveness also lies in the fact that I have a right to tell you who I am and what I think and how I feel, and you have a right to do the same. And should you and I not agree with each other, then we can negotiate. And that's essentially it. That includes work situations, those of you who are bosses, those of you who are managers and supervisors, telling your employees that you are unhappy about something that they do, or in fact that you are appreciative or happy about something that they do. Both are necessary to be able to compliment people, praise people, also to give them corrective feedback, taking ownership, and then telling them what to do. It also includes setting limits. It also includes at times telling people what the consequences will be if they continue to perform poorly. As an assertive manager and supervisor, you will begin to use that honest feedback on a continuing basis, not just once a year, not just twice a year in a performance review, but rather on a more or less daily basis, giving people feedback so that they can correct their actions immediately, they can grow, they can perform better and produce the results that you want. That's the communication you need to use. And it's not always going to be pleasant. Now, if you're in the business of winning a popularity contest, assertiveness may not be for you. Although I don't know anybody who wins popularity contests, not even the people pleaser. Because my hunch is that people who are out to please others are quite often not liked by at least one person who doesn't approve of the fact they're trying to please everybody. And so I don't know anybody who wins popularity contests. Assertive people are not in to win in this business of assertiveness in order to win popularity contests. What assertiveness people are after is this reputation. You may not always like what he or she has to say to you, but you always know where you stand. And to me, that's the best kind of reputation to have. There are a few disadvantages to being an assertive individual. Sometimes people will not like you anymore because they can't exploit you anymore. Sometimes people will go and find somebody else, some other sucker whom they can exploit. And when that happens, say good riddance. I don't need those people in my life, okay? Most of the people in your life who are your friends will stay with you, and they'll adjust to your new way of communicating to them. The other slight and very short-lived disadvantage is that quite often, if you're dealing with an aggressive person, you start asserting yourself. They'll start becoming slightly more aggressive. And I would be less than honest if I wouldn't tell you that. It's very important to remember. Lest you think that assertiveness doesn't work. If you're dealing with a highly aggressive individual, maybe a boss, and you start saying, boss, please, just a minute, I would like very much if you would be less personal about your criticism of me. The guy may go, who do you think you are? And start becoming more aggressive because you see, that fighting behavior, that bullying behavior has worked in the past, and all of a sudden it doesn't work anymore. What's wrong here? And those reactions are automatic, by the way. It's not very intentional. And so they'll start putting a little bit more pressure on you. When that happens, please remember that that is quite normal, and that you can sort of expect that that might happen. Hang in there. If you give in at that point, what you will teach that person, whether you want to or not, whether it's your intention to or not, what you will teach that aggressive individual is, it works, increased aggression works. And so next time they deal with you, they will start at the new level of aggression. See? Say, oh, that's all I have to do. Just push a little bit harder, threaten a little bit more. Next time they deal with you, they'll start at that new level. So what you need to do is hang in there. If you're dealing with a highly aggressive individual, and that includes customers, clients, and so on and so forth, suppliers, all the people that you deal with, if you see that happening, let a warning signal go in your head and say, all I have to do is hang in there. Now that's the time when you have to pat yourself on the back and you have to say, it's all right, it's all right. Doesn't mean assertiveness doesn't work, okay? Because eventually they'll back down. We have a term in learning theory that describes that phenomenon. We call it the extinction burst. And the extinction burst essentially means it only goes up, that behavior intensifies a little bit, and then it extinguishes, it drops out. Okay. What are the advantages of being assertive? There are so many of them. I can promise you one thing, you will start feeling better about yourself. You're going to start feeling so much better about yourself. Now, remember I said earlier there will be a little bit of a twinge of guilt for some of you. Just keep doing it. The guilt will go away. The advantage then will be that you will start feeling like you're taking care of yourself. You're doing what's required. You will no longer feel like people can push you around. You're going to develop more of a sense of self-confidence. And of course you will also influence other people. You will teach people how to treat you differently. You will. There's no doubt. I have experienced that in my own life. They will at least know what you like and what you don't like. And many of the people who care about you will adjust their own behavior in order to give you quite often what it is that you want. You will also be seen as a much more powerful person in your work environment. You'll get things done more. You will find you save time because you won't have to be so terribly polite to people. You'll save more time. You will give instructions more easily. You will be more clear in your communication. You will not be as sensitive and not as likely to tiptoe around people. You will start to feel like a load goes off your back because you allow other people to take care of themselves. You won't feel this tremendous obligation that so many of us feel, that I've got to take care of others. And I have to always second guess how I need to talk to them. That is such a load off your back. I cannot express and emphasize it enough. To allow other people to take care of themselves. And of course you will be seen much more as a leader type. People who can be assertive and stand up for themselves and express their opinions are seen as leaders. They are seen as the kind of folks that can pull others in the direction, the goal of the company, and so on. And that's exactly the image that you will produce. Now, I just noticed I had not given you the nonverbal indicators of assertiveness, and so forgive me. Let me catch up with that one. Assertive people look like they belong. That is one statement that Michael Korda had used in his research on power. He essentially investigated people who are perceived as powerful, and what he found was that they looked like they belong. Not as the passive person quite often looks apologetic and says, you know, I look like an accident, I must be an accident. They do the opposite of that, but not pompous. Essentially, they keep an appropriate distance between themselves and the other person, but they stand erect, they stand tall. They keep their heads straight. They look as though they were relaxed in their environment. And the word relaxed is very important, because we have found that when you relax your body, I'm not talking about slumping and slouching. I am talking about no visible tension in your face, in your hands, and so on. As Michael Korda says, quiet hands and quiet face. You hold yourself erect, but there's no visible tension. That is what gives people that look of power. That is what gives people that look of confidence. Whether you stand or whether you walk, looking as though you had a right to be where you are. Korda says powerful people look like they belong even when they're in someone else's office or bed. Good eye contact. Looking at people with interest, with attention, letting you know that I care about what you say, is also part of assertive body language. Congruent facial expressions. My face has to agree with what comes out of my mouth. Otherwise, people get confused. I have to say the same thing with my face as I say with my words. Otherwise, you're not going to know which way I mean it. Very important. If you want to smile, if you want to be friendly, you want people to see you as well-meaning, well-intentioned, then by all means make your face look like that. And it's not a given that people do that. I have met many a person who has shaken my hand with a frown on his or her face, saying, "So glad to meet you." Now, do I listen to the words? No. I look at their face, I look at their depressed, probably frowning face, and listen to their tone of voice, and I say to myself, sure, you're glad to meet me. So you have to get that facial expression that confirms that you mean what you say. That's how people determine sincerity. Looking at your face and saying, does the face agree with the words? And that goes for the tone of voice. An assertive person's tone of voice also re-emphasizes the body language. Relaxed, calm, we call it a calm tone of voice, conversational tone of voice. However, they project their voices so that people can hear them, not whispery. And they try not to give any signals through fidgeting with their hands and with their feet and so on and so forth. That will distract people, take away from their conversation, take away from their messages, and give some kind of signal that they are uncomfortable about being in that situation. I began learning about assertiveness in the early 1970s. As a matter of fact, I began teaching it at Metro State College in Denver about 1975. And my introduction to it was about 1971-72. And I've been working on it ever since. And if you think that I am assertive all the time, wrong. You know what I found myself doing the other day? we had, it was just on Sunday, we had our swimming pool. We bought a house 3 years ago with a swimming pool for the first time, and it was such a delight. Oh, are we sorry? You have no idea how costly it is. Anyway, we're not really sorry. We look forward to using it every summer. And there was a guy, we had it resurfaced, and there were two guys putting the cement, you know, the new surface on the swimming pool. And there was a step. We have some rounded steps, and they had to reform those steps. And one of them looked a little bit lopsided. And so I looked at it, and I thought, that step isn't completely round. Rather than talking to the guys who were doing the work, turned around, I went inside the house, and I said to my husband, would you go out there and see if that step is, or is it just me? Am I just looking at it, am I too nitpicky, or do you think that step really isn't round? And so he went out there and he said, well, it's not bad. You know, it looks pretty much okay. And then he looked at me and he said, why didn't you tell those guys you didn't like the step? And I see, my husband has been dealing with this assertiveness business for a long time, and he knew right away that I was chickening out. He knew it, okay? And so why didn't you say something to them?
Had your mouth full of feathers.
Uh-huh. Had my mouth full of feathers, that's right. So, you know, I can be perfectly assertive in some situations. In other situations, sometimes I don't even know why. Sometimes it's a person's face that just looks to me like, this is not going to turn out well, so I better shut up. You know? But the thing to remember always is let experience guide you as to whether you're going to say something, whether you're not going to say something. Don't let your irrational fears dictate whether you're going to assert yourself or not. Always think of your own, what we call enlightened self-interest. Enlightened self-interest means, in the long run, am I going to benefit from saying something, or am I going to get harmed based on past experience? Is there a good chance that I will be harmed? Let that be your guiding principle as to whether you're going to say something or not. Now, here's a secret, folks. If you make an active decision based on good evidence that you better not speak up, you better keep your mouth shut, you're not going to feel like a wimp because you have made that choice. You will feel like a wimp, however, if you act or refuse to act because you're too afraid, because you think people are too powerful, because you are essentially too anxious to do anything, or you're too concerned about other people's feelings, and opinions. And then you will feel like a wimp. But if you make an active choice, you're going to say, hey, I'm no dummy. I know exactly what side my bread is buttered on, and so I'm not going to say anything. Then you will still feel in charge. Remember that control I was talking about earlier? It's the opposite of that learned helplessness. And that's what will make it, that'll make the difference in your life. It is far harder to go from aggressive to assertive than it is to go from passive to assertive. And why is that? Because aggressive people quite often visibly see the effect they have on other people, and they interpret that compliance as, I'm producing results. They never think of the long-range consequences. There are some people in my environment who are very aggressive, and they are that way pretty consistently. And so I'm constantly struggling with how to respond to people like that. Sometimes you talk about the process in which they approach you. The process of communication is always the how. How do they do it? And so you might say to somebody, look, back down, you are coming on way too strong with me, and I react very negatively to that. That's one option you have, okay? And quite often that does the trick, because sometimes those people don't even know that they're coming on that strong. But they may not always do the job. Sometimes you just have to react in a more aggressive fashion with them. There is, however, a saying. There is a saying in our society. It says, stand up to the bully and he'll become your friend. Now, I will not suggest that you stand up to a bully if the bully is going to clobber you physically, all right? But I certainly would suggest that quite often if you stand up to somebody. I had a father who was very aggressive, and so I know what it's like to stand up to an aggressive person. I did not stand up to this man until I was an adult. I was married and I had children. And that's when I started standing up to my father. And it was in public. We had been out celebrating my mother's birthday. And my father was one of those should people. He was everything. The ex-manager, occasionally he would gunny sack. I mean, you know, he just, but most of the time he would just very spontaneously react when flare up and have a temper tantrum. And he always came across, he had under controlled anger. And so, you know, we had a saying around our house. My brother used to say, he doesn't get ulcers, he gives them. And whenever he was unhappy about something, it didn't matter whether it was a cab driver who overcharged him a quarter or whether it was somebody fixing something in the house that he didn't like, he would always go and check up on any workman who was in the house. He would nitpick about every little thing. This isn't right, that isn't right. What am I paying you for? Why aren't you doing the job correctly? I mean, it's just always ready to criticize and correct people. Well, we were out in the restaurant celebrating my mother's birthday. And the waitress walked by him, past him, and accidentally knocked her tray into his head. He shot out of that chair and started yelling at the waitress. And I had always been assigned a seat next to him. Helga always had to sit next to Dad. Okay? And I knew, because I'd seen this before, I knew that this was not going to end well. Should have seen the waitress, okay? It was like, oh my God, what's going to happen to me? His face was red and his jaws were working and the evil eye and what are you doing? And can't you watch out? What's the matter with you? And so I got up. I finally had it, right? Years of this. I got up so that I would be level with his eyes as much as possible. He was much taller than I, but at least, you know, it was some semblance of eye level. And I said, Dad, and I can't tell you how my voice was shaking. My knees were shaking. I said, Dad, sit down. You should have seen everybody. My mother sat at the other end of the table, my husband, my kids, my brother and his kids. I mean, you're talking about lots of people in this, right? And there was this pregnant pause. And I thought for a minute, why did I say this? Okay? He's going to clobber me. I know him now. I'm going to get it. I should have let him hit the waitress instead of me. And we had kept this eye contact. You know, what seemed like ages, but it was only a few seconds. And all of a sudden, he goes down, sits down, doesn't say, all he did was, right? And continues to eat. And then I sat down, and of course there was this, you know, a long moment of embarrassment. Nobody said anything, and then finally we resumed our conversation as though nothing had happened. Now, after that happened, I thought to myself, I can't believe I did that. I cannot believe that he actually did what I told him to do. Now, my relationship with my father changed after that, as you can easily imagine, all right? So it isn't always that aggressive people will start becoming more aggressive. It isn't always. And the reason my relationship with him changed was not so much because I made him change, but because my confidence in the presence of my father was tremendously increased. I started realizing that I had some effect on this man. And I used it more and more often, which in turn made him respond differently back to me. And I thought my whole family would come rushing up to me, first chance they get, and say, that was terrific, Helga Rhode. Or Helga, you know, that was terrific. How did you ever do that? How did you ever get the guts to do that? No way. You know what they said to me? How could you do that to Dad? And you know what I have found over the years, and other practitioners, clinicians have found? There's something going on in the world. When people are aggressive, quite often the folks who are on the receiving end of that aggression protect them. We protect those people. Now, don't ask me why. I think it's because we have some vicarious feeling of power through them, and we don't want to see them embarrassed. They do in many ways help us, don't they? They get things done, at least in the short run. Quite often, those people, They get someplace, you know, they get things from people. And so they quite often help us, and we feel some kind of vicarious, we have a vicarious experience through those people. And so we don't want to see them embarrassed. We don't want to see a powerful person embarrassed. And it happens in the work setting. I've done enough consulting to know that it happens in the work setting. Not too long ago, a woman approached me and she said, I don't understand this. We have this young man who joined our organization, our team, and we've been around for a while. And this guy comes in and he's highly aggressive and he gets away with it. We let him get away with it. Can you tell me why? He pushes people around. He doesn't have a whole lot of position power. But through his demeanor, he pushes people around. He tells everybody what to do, and people talk about him behind his back. Nobody has the guts to face him. Environment that protects that kind of individual. Nobody wants to embarrass the guy. Isn't that interesting? There was a little study done, published in a magazine recently, that says the following. For at least a decade, insurance plans have made second opinions optional. What that essentially means is that when you are an insured, and you have medical insurance, and your insurance company quite often makes available a second opinion should you need surgery, should you need some traumatic intervention. And so they say, don't just take your doctor's advice, you can go to a second doctor and we'll pay for it. Only 1 to 2% of insured patients ever use the options. 1 to 2%. Now, what do you think the reason was that was given by the people who did not make use of this option? What do you think? They did not want to embarrass their first physician. The research found the following. The reason that people did not use this option is that they felt, the patients feared offending the first physician. So you see, we might be perfectly assertive when we are talking to maybe an airline ticket agent, but when it comes sometimes to a power figure in our lives, we will be less than assertive. We will even take the risk of having surgery that is unnecessary, possibly, before we go to another physician because we don't want to hurt the feelings of the first physician. Isn't that incredible?
This is the end of Tape 2, Side B of Assertiveness Training with Dr. Helga Rhode. Please load Cassette 3, Side A now, as Helga exposes the negative effects of aggressive management. This is Tape 4, Side A of Assertiveness Training by Dr. Helga Rhode.
Let's talk about some specific assertive responses that have been identified through research, that have been compiled, refined, studied, and so on, categorizations of assertive responses. I shall tell you what they are good for, what situations you can use them in, and give you some more specific information on what guidelines to follow in using them. The simplest of them all is called simple assertion. And simple assertion is also a very good way to start being assertive. As a matter of fact, those of you who have not been very assertive at all in your work environment, please start by expressing yourself positively. It's a very non-threatening, very good way to start being assertive. As a boss, as a supervisor manager, as a parent, what have you. Simple assertion essentially means very simply and spontaneously expressing something positive to a person. Maybe they do something right. Of course, first you have to catch them doing it right, and then you say to them, that was good, great, I like it. If they're doing something that you don't approve of, if you are irritated or annoyed by something, don't save it up until performance review time or for a rainy day until you're good and mad. Say it right away. Very simply, please don't do that. No, I don't like it. I don't want to be interrupted. No, I'd like to go to lunch with my friends. I'll see you later. As my client that I talked about, it was not able to do or was not willing to do. Very simple, quick statements so that people know where they stand, what you are thinking about, where your mind is at. We can really look at positive remarks as praises, compliments, expression of positive feelings. Those are all expressions, statements that fall into the area of positive feedback. And negative expressions or expressions of negative feelings. Negative feelings are usually those that we consider to be unpleasant. They cause us some discomfort, anger, I am disappointed, I'm sad, and so on. Always remembering to use I language, being spontaneous as quickly as possible, and also straightforward. Always remember, we're talking about simple assertion as expressing oneself honestly and straightforwardly and making your face agree with your word. Here are the guidelines for both of those, whether you are giving positive feedback or corrective feedback. Remember to be as specific as possible. You will enhance the impact you have on people. You will make your remarks much more believable if you are specific. Let me give you an example. When you are praising an employee, don't just walk up to that employee and say, you know, you are doing a dynamite job. They may feel good when they hear it, but it doesn't really have an effect on their performance. Unless you tell them what it is that they're doing specifically that you think is dynamite performance. If you want to praise somebody for the way they conducted a meeting, don't just say you did a great job at this meeting. Say to them, boy, that was good. You started on time, you gave everybody a chance to talk, you summarized statements very well, you kept the meeting on track, we never veered from the agenda, and when people started talking about extraneous things, you brought them right back to the point, and we got the results. We got decisions on many of the items that we had attempted. That was great. Now what you have done is given information to the person that will allow them to do the same thing again. They know specifically what they have to do in order to get your approval and your praise again. And it becomes an incentive. That's the whole point. It makes a vast difference whether you give somebody a general praise, a general comment, or whether you are specific. Not only that, when you are specific, people will actually believe your compliment or your praise because they can look at the evidence. They know you've based it on evidence. You're not saying it just because you have a good day and you're in a good mood. Okay. That will also allow you to address the good behavior, that you will base your praise, your compliment, on the good performance of people. It is incorrect to say to people, just praise your employees. There's much more to it than that. The praise has to be based on their performance, and they have to know it. And so you have to tell them specifically what they did. The next rule, and that also goes for corrective feedback, same thing. When you tell somebody they have not done as they should have, they have not performed as you expected, tell them what they did so that you can forego and prevent the error that aggressive people make. that people are less likely to take it personally. Don't attack the person. Don't say your attitude stinks. Tell them what they did that was not good. You're not coming back from lunch on time. You're coming back late, 15 minutes. What that means is you rob us of 15 minutes of time that we pay for you. Talk about their behavior. Don't talk about them as people. Be very specific. The second rule about simple assertion is that it has to be done as quickly as possible. It is not nearly as effective if you say to somebody, you did a job in that meeting today that was unacceptable. Here's what you did if you do it a week after it happened. People say, so big deal. It's that immediacy, that immediate feedback that makes people, that changes their behavior, that has such influence on them. This is where your biggest power lies on a day-to-day basis. That assertion once in a while is not going to be nearly as effective and powerful as the day-to-day telling people what they do right and giving people corrective feedback. That's how you can have an impact on folks who work for you, who work with you, and people for whom you work. And don't forget to praise the boss. As I very often say to students in my class, teachers also need apples, please, okay? Lots of them. And so your bosses also need. If you want to turn a difficult boss around, one of the best ways to start is to praise their good performance. Let's take a boss who procrastinates. Decisions, no. They don't always procrastinate decisions. Every once in a while they make one that is timely. You catch them at that and you say, boss, I really appreciate that you gave me your decision. It allows me time to follow through on it. You gave me your decision today. That gives me enough time to do my work. That's the stuff that will get people motivated. And there's lots of evidence to show that. It's not just nice, not just because we like it, but because it works. So follow those two rules. Third thing to remember is that when you give people compliments and praises, please don't overdo it. The principle you have to use is the slot machine principle. The reason people gamble is because they never know when they're going to get money. They keep pulling that one-armed bandit. And what keeps them pulling it is because they don't know, is it going to be now or do I have to do it 10 more times? There's always that feeling of anticipation. There's a little bit of excitement about it. I know, I've been to Las Vegas several times. I will play that slot machine until I can't stand on my feet anymore. I take off my shoes, I take off my jacket. I mean, it's a wonder I don't take off the rest of my clothes. I get very hot and very excited and very tired, and I just keep doing it because I never know when that money's going to come out. And same thing is true in praising people. Do it once in a while. Don't do it all the time. There's a woman recently whose manager, whose boss had been to a seminar where they taught them how to praise people. They forgot to tell them that you can only do it once in a while. Otherwise you cause inflation. Otherwise people get sick of it. And she said, you know, my manager just went to one of those seminars, and since she's back, I can't stand to be around her anymore. I like the woman, but she's impossible. Every time I sharpen a pencil, she'll approach me and say, oh, that was wonderful. That was great. God, I want you to know what a good job you're doing. And she said, of course, every time I see her coming, I want to throw up. Okay, so be very cautious about that. Some of you may have problems giving compliments. Practice it. Start with your kids. Practice with your spouses. Those are valuable things that you can do for yourself and your family. Don't miss the moment to tell somebody something good. It may change a person's life. You never know that. Never know that. Those of you who may have seen In Search of Excellence, the video that was on public television, may remember there was one manager pictured who used some reward system, giving people money for good ideas and also patting them on the back. And it's just a lot of recognition for good work. And when he talked about what an impact he has on his employees, the tears were running down his face. Because some people in this world never get any goodies. And we can give so much benefit to people. We just remember that all of us do some things right. And we have to recognize it, we have to see it, and we have to tell them about it. But don't overdo it. When you give corrective feedback for people, The rule, the slot machine rule, does not apply. The rule you need to follow is the vending machine rule. For every time they do something wrong, if you see it and notice it, you've got to tell them about it. Balance, however, your positive comments much more heavily. You want to give about 4 times as many positives as negatives. Simple assertion, letting people know how they're doing right away. The next response that I want to talk about is called understanding assertion. Understanding assertion is that empathy that we also need to show people, even though we're assertive, even though we're straightforward and honest, even though we're direct with people, we sometimes also want to step a little bit more lightly. We might want to consider somebody who is particularly sensitive, somebody who has learned how to be afraid of others. We might want to use a little bit more empathy. So understanding assertion is what we sometimes call an empathic response. It takes into consideration that other people may have some hurt feelings. It takes into consideration that all of us, I don't care who we are, would like to save face. We don't want to look bad in the eyes of other people. Essentially, when we use understanding assertion, empathic assertion, we are sending at least 2 messages at the same time. One of them is, I do not assume malice on your part. And secondly, I mean you no harm. What that really means is that we are quite often well advised to use a lead-in statement. When we have to approach somebody, let us suppose you have to tell one of your employees that they smell bad. Have any of you ever had to do that? Boy, is that tough. Anything that concerns physical hygiene, personal hygiene, we would rather not touch it with a 10-foot pole. We'd rather run the other way. But some of us have to do it. And so you say, we agonize over it. We think about, how am I going to say that? Got to say it. If it affects the job, you've got to say it. If the person is being ostracized by others and they're unhappy and it affects their performance, so you've got to say something about it. How do I say it? Use a lead-in statement. You may not be aware of this. When I say that, essentially what I'm saying is, look, I know you're not doing it intentionally. Doesn't that take us off the hook? Doesn't that let us off the hook? It does, doesn't it, in a way? However, how you say it is very important. If you say it flippantly, it will not have an impact. Quite often, putting your hand on the other person's hand, if that's admissible. Touch is very powerful. We have found there's research that shows that people respond to touch very positively. Appropriate touch, maybe touch on the hand, touch on the forearm, or looking at somebody with compassion. And when you say, I know you may not be aware of this, what I am essentially conveying to you is, I'm not assuming that you are sloppy and you don't care about yourself. And that makes it just a little bit easier for the person to accept the comment, okay? As one of my students said to me in my class, I don't understand why you have to do that. I don't see what's so hard about telling somebody that they smell bad. He said, I had somebody, he was a flight instructor, and I got a student who wanted to learn how to fly a plane, and he said I couldn't stand the guy, he smelled so bad. So I just turned to him and I said, you stink. Well, to me, that's slightly aggressive. There was a woman in one of my seminars who said, honest to God, it seems so simple. I should have known that. I used to have a boss who had a mannerism of rolling up his tie. He would sit in meetings, and all of us would be sitting around discussing things, and he would start at the bottom of his tie and start rolling it up, and roll until he got to the knot, and then he would sort of spread out his hands, let it fall down, smooth it out, and then start all over again. And she said, none of us wanted to embarrass him, so we never said anything. What they did instead was go out and buy him a bow tie and send it to him anonymously, all right? And when he got the bow tie, he said, is somebody trying to tell me something? Well, the problem was that none of them ever listened to him in the meeting. They gave him eye contact, and they would always look at his hands to see how far he had gotten with his tie. And essentially, they never paid attention to what the guy said. And it would have been so easy for one of them to take him aside after the meeting and say, "Boss, you may not be aware of it, but you have a mannerism of rolling up your tie, and none of us ever listen to you talk because we're always watching you." Guy probably would have laughed. Another situation, another empathic response. "I know you don't mean anything by it." What does that mean? I know you don't mean anything by it when you call me honey, dear, sweetheart, sugar, babe. Women in the audience, what's your favorite one? Babe. Baby? Oh, baby's even worse. Broad. How do I say that to somebody? How do I say that to a customer? Somebody who calls me, essentially, I don't want to lose that person. I don't want to lose that customer or client. But it just wrinkles. When they call me sugar, I always feel like I'm this little kid. Do something about it, but do it kindly. Say, "I know you don't mean anything by it, but would you please not call me sugar? I like to be called Helga." Kind, conversational tone of voice. Most people will react positively. Okay? A variety of things. If you have to implement some policies that are hard for people to change, to incorporate, new things that happen around the office, maybe you have to assign more work to people, and they're already feeling overworked. How can I transmit that to them? I don't have any options. I'm the boss. Got to tell them it's got to be done. Say to them, "I know this is hard. I recognize it's hard, and I realize you don't want to do it, but it's got to be done. But do that with a great deal of feeling. You've got to sound compassionate, otherwise it's going to lose its effect." People abuse that sometimes. I have seen bosses walk up to their secretaries and say, "I know this is hard for you, but do you think you can manage to type this letter without mistakes?" That's sarcasm, and it loses its effectiveness. But showing empathy is sometimes all you need to do to rally people around you. Recognizing that some things are not pleasant, and that you are trying to understand what it's like to be in their shoes. And the last one, "I see what you mean. However, you may not have all the facts. For those situations in which somebody has a temper tantrum, potential embarrassment to you, being reasonable rather than right, and saying to the person, letting them spout off and saying, 'I see what you mean.' That doesn't mean I agree. All it means is I have been reasonable enough to listen to you." It gives you something to say in an embarrassing moment, in a very potentially increasing conflict, increasing hostility. At that moment, quite often you say, "I can't just sit here and not say anything, but if I say something, the person might even have a bigger temper tantrum and be even more abusive of me. But I've got to say something so that I don't look bad in front of other people." Say that something. Say things like, "I see what you mean." Yes, that does deserve a response. Those are all benign statements. They allow you to be assertive and at the same time not increase the hostility. Okay. And if you have a good sense of humor, sometimes a sense of humor helps. Especially in the face of somebody who's highly aggressive, and you find something funny, although you have to use that with caution, because sometimes people who are very hostile don't respond well to humor. Don't ever use humor that involves them, but maybe making a crack about yourself, or laughing at yourself can also help. I'll give you an example of that. There is a woman in Chicago, is actually a boss of a friend of mine, and she gave a speech to a large group of people and in Chicago. And 2 years before, she had talked to the same group. And here she was standing talking about something, and somebody in the audience had it in for her. Very hostile, aggressive individual got up and yelled at her in front of all these people. 2 years ago, you told us exactly the opposite of what you're telling us today. What are you talking about? And she very calmly looked at the person, first calmed down, probably took a deep breath in order to relax herself, and looked him right in the eye and said, "Sir, 2 years ago, I lied." Great, huh? All right. The next response is called the minimal effective assertion and escalation. It is called the minimally effective response, okay? Essentially what that means is that in most situations in which you have occasion to assert yourself, whether that is with a boss or, well, primarily with subordinates or strangers, minimally effective response refers quite often to subordinate relationships or relationships with strangers. You will see in a minute why. Minimal effective assertion means that when you have to deal with a difficult situation, start with the least muscle level. Don't jump in there and say, I'm going to teach them a lesson right now so that they know and I'll never have to do it again. In most cases, if you use the least muscle level, people will respond. Making a request, making a simple request will usually get you what you want. Because most folks in the world are not rude people. They make mistakes. They might inadvertently do something. They might ask you to do things that they wouldn't ask somebody else simply because you've always said yes to them. So just a simple no, or please don't do that, or yes, I'd like, or whatever, will usually get you what you want. In the literature, in the research that's been done, the example that's used most often is an example of sitting in the movies and there are people sitting around you who are talking and you can't hear what's going on. What's the minimally effective response? Shh. See, we all know it. And that's what we use. In many situations we use it. In other situations we come on way too strong. Or we don't say anything at all. Minimally effective response is also a way that we teach people who are predominantly passive to begin being assertive. So you say, shh. Now what happens if they don't shut up? What do you do then? You say, shut up, right. We go from one to the other. Hey, what's the next thing you say after shh?
Please be quiet.
Please be quiet. See the escalation? All right. What if they still don't stop talking? What's the next thing you say? And now you say shut up, right? We all have our limits. I mean, you know, some of us can wait a little longer than others. The next thing you do is you drop the please. Isn't that true, folks? Unless you are quiet, what am I going to do? Call the manager. You see? This is when I start spelling out the consequences. Lest you get the idea that telling people what the consequences are is aggressive, it is not. However, we suggest that you leave it as a last resort. Don't do that right away. That's what aggressive people do. Aggressive people will say right away, look, you either do this right or I'm going to fire you or I'm going to transfer you. That's not. You use that as a last resort. When you have to escalate and it's the last thing that you say to people. If you're about to fire somebody, always give them a warning. Say, look, hey, I've tried, I've warned you, I've given you several warnings. Next time you do it, I'm going to let you go. So they have some warning. But what you do essentially is always make them aware that they make that choice. You are forced to do something for the sake of the organization, for the sake of peace, for the sake of getting the work done. Here's the consequence. Now, it's up to you whether you're going to go for that or whether you're going to avoid that consequence. But always leave that as a last resort. But that's essentially, okay? You start with the minimum that is effective most of the time, and if that doesn't work, you just keep going, moving up. Okay. Next one is called confrontive assertion. And it's essentially a way of criticizing people. It's essentially a way of giving people feedback, of letting them know that you're unhappy about their performance. It's one form of a reprimand, essentially. The confrontive assertion is only for subordinate relationships. You don't use that with a boss. You do not use that with a spouse. Nor do you normally use it with a stranger, although you may. You may consider a stranger, a merchant, somebody who has not followed through on their promises, who hasn't given you value and quality for your money. You can consider that person as being in a somewhat subordinate relationship. Depends on how you look at it. Essentially, the confrontive assertion is telling people what they have done wrong. Not what's wrong with them, but what they have done wrong. And I'd like for you to be very aware of the progression of that. It does make a difference on how you say it. What comes first, what comes next. The sequence is important and has been shown to be important through various studies. First thing you do is tell the person objectively what they have done, what they were supposed to have done. And for that reason, it's quite often good for people who have already agreed, I'm going to do this, or who have been assigned or delegated a certain job. And so you say to them objectively, look, you had promised to get that report to me by today. Now you tell me you're not going to get it to me until tomorrow. So you remind them of their commitment, and then you tell them very objectively what they have not done or are not going to do. The next thing you want to say is, how does that affect the results you want to produce in the organization? I mean, people don't work in a vacuum. When you do something or not do something, that affects other people. And I tell you, it is motivating for me to know that. Lest I forget, I'm not just shuffling papers. What I do affects other people. And that is highly motivating for many folks, many folks. And so you say to the person, look, when you don't give me, if you don't give me that data or that report until next week, I've got to go into a meeting tomorrow. What that means is we can't make our decision. We cannot make a timely decision on that project. I need those figures to that project. Not only that, we're going to waste our time. Or I have to call up all the people who are supposed to be at the meeting and tell them to cancel. So it has an effect on other human beings. Now, once I have said that, those are the three major components. What were you supposed to have done? What are you doing or didn't you do? And what effect does it have on the results and on other people? That includes me. I might say such things as, I am really angry about that, because now I've got to go and apologize to those folks. Once you have said that, and always remember, KISS rule, succinct, quick. Don't spread it out. Not too many words. Just get to the meat right quick. Once you've done that, you want to take a deep breath, pause for a moment, because what you're going to say next will be a different focus, will take on a different focus. What you want to say next to the person is, look, you are one of my best people. I always rely on you. I wouldn't even know what to do without you. So how are we going to solve this problem? How can we prevent this from happening again? What I want to do is pat that person on the back, not praise them, please. You never confuse a praise with a reprimand. If you do that, people will get real confused. It's unfortunate that there are still people out in the world who teach that we ought to sandwich a reprimand into two praises. First you tell them, oh, you're doing good work, it's great, wonderful. However, you loused up, and then pat them on the back and I'll say, just keep on doing good work. It's called the sandwich approach. Wrong. People get confused. They don't know what to take seriously. They don't know which is more important. When you reprimand people, that's all you do. They have to know that that's all that's going to happen, so they never get confused. And when you praise people, you never slip in a reprimand. So what you want to do is reprimand them first, tell them what makes you unhappy, and then you encourage them. Just to get the idea in their mind that you were criticizing their performance and not them as people. That you still say, hey, you're a good person, even though you do some stupid things, okay? That's the whole point. Reprimands are hard to give. If you're not used to that, it's also one of the best things you can learn to do. It's one of the things you've got to learn to do if you want to be effective in your organization. If you have never done it, please start with your children, okay? It's a safe thing. They can't fire you. They can't complain about you. They can't do anything. They've got to tolerate it. And so do it with your kids first so you can get some skill in doing it. Some cautions. I really would like to caution you about when not to give a reprimand. One of them is, do not reprimand somebody who is in training. If you reprimand a person who is in training, you will essentially demotivate them. It's hard enough to learn new things. And if people come down hard on you when you make a mistake, you still don't know how to do it well, you just want to throw in the towel. When people are still learning a new task, keep encouraging them. Don't reprimand them. You might correct them. You can say, hey, no, not this way, that way. Just keep going. You're doing fine. That's fine. But don't reprimand them. Second thing, watch the timing. Do it as quickly as possible so that they can see the connection between their poor performance and your reprimand.
If you wait till performance review time, it will have lost its impact altogether. That is why performance reviews are not very effective. I hate to tell you, but they're not. Those of you who are serious about using assertiveness as a way of improving your communication and the results you produce through people, I have a suggestion for you. When you praise and when you reprimand people, put it on a slip of paper, maybe just a piece of note paper. Slip it into the person's file. When you go to do your performance review and you start to write up what you're going to say to the employee and what you're going to give to the employee, you will have all those pieces of evidence. It'll be much more accurate, and people will know what you're talking about. You will have an effect on your employees, I promise you that. So watch the timing, do it as quickly as possible. The rule is ASAP, as soon as possible, and do it privately. Don't ever reprimand somebody in front of other people. It's amazing how many folks do that. They say, oh, they'll learn a lesson. If I do it in front of others and really embarrass them, they'll never do it again. That may be, but they will also see you as an aggressor, and they will not give you their commitment. The third thing to watch out for is essentially that you have spelled out your expectations, that you are not thinking, yeah, I told them what to do, but essentially you haven't, and so you go and reprimand somebody. You will embarrass yourself if they say, boss, you never told me that you wanted me to do that, and then you have to apologize. That may happen, and when it does happen, you do apologize, but try to prevent it and say, look, have I really told the employee what I expect? And if you haven't, and then a reprimand is not in order. And there's one more, the fourth one, is determine whether people have some extraneous reason for acting poorly. If you have an employee, maybe with trauma in their lives, they may not want to tell you. They may not want to say, I've got family problems, or my wife and I are getting a divorce. Or they may not say to you, you know, I have found that I have a drinking problem. They may not want us to tell you. As a matter of fact, they probably won't. And so, as much as possible, find out whether there are some other ways, some other reasons, I should say, for why people are performing poorly. And then, because that takes different measure. Assertiveness will not solve the problem.
This is the end of Tape 4, Side A. Now fast forward this cassette to the end and turn it over to hear the conclusion of Assertiveness Training with Dr. Helga Rhode. This is Tape 4, Side B, the conclusion of Assertiveness Training with Dr. Helga Rhode.
There is a very effective and very powerful technique that is similar to confrontive assertion, except it is for peer relationships. You can use it with bosses, you can use it with spouses. And it is called the desk script. The desk script, essentially, is an acronym for describing to the person what they are doing that is causing you some problems, expressing your opinions and feelings about it, specifying what you would like for them to do instead, and spelling out the consequences. The C stands for consequences. What will happen if you and I can negotiate a different contract, different behavior, if you will change your behavior, if you will agree to do things differently, what will be the consequences of that? And that is essentially what we mean by DESC, D-E-S-C. Let's take an example. Let us suppose that I would like to confront a peer with a problem. And the problem might be that I am finding myself sharing a secretary with somebody else. You and I are using the same secretary, and I find out that you go to the secretary and you tell her to put my work aside and do yours first. And so I have to wait for my work. It's a rather common problem. And so I decide to approach you. How am I going to do that? Well, I have some choices. I can go and be a people pleaser and say, you know, I don't know whether you have been aware, but our secretary is sort of falling behind in her work a little bit. And my peer says, no, I haven't noticed anything. And you say, yeah, well, I have sort of found that my work doesn't get done, and I really don't know what the real problem is. Hey, have you maybe been giving her more work than you usually do? No, not really. Well, I don't know. I'm sort of unhappy with what she does because my work sort of gets shoved aside, and I'm not sure why that happens. What do you think I ought to do about it? Typical passive person's way of handling such a situation. Never gets anywhere. Problem is never solved. Or I have the choice of approaching my peer aggressively and saying, who the hell do you think you are? I mean, you go to our secretary to give her work to do when I have already, she's working on my stuff. Now let me warn you about this. If that happens one more time, I'm going to talk to the boss. Very aggressive. Or I have a choice of using the desk script and negotiating a behavior change. And so what I am choosing to do is to approach my peer, my coworker, in this fashion. When you tell our secretary to put my work aside and do yours first, I have just described what happened. Objectively. No accusations. When you approach our secretary and tell her to do your work first and put mine aside, I get very angry because I consider that uncooperative and I consider that unfair. So I express my feelings, I express my opinion. If you will agree to come and see me first, when you have something urgent to do, come and see me so that we can negotiate whose work gets done first. Now I'm telling my peer what it is that I want him to do instead. Then, and now I want to tell what the consequences are. Then we will not only eliminate unnecessary competition, but we'll also be able to work together better, and we'll make life easier for our secretary. It's going to be a lot easier for our secretary. Now, why do I want to point that out? Because there's got to be some benefit in the other person, too. Or there's got to be something in it for them, too. And so I point out what the positive consequences are. I'm making my request. I am not accusing the person, and I have a better chance of negotiating something. And, of course, I don't want to leave before you agree to my proposal. Now, if you don't agree, you can all say, hey, that's not going to work for me. Okay? What would you suggest? How can we solve this problem? Because as far as I'm concerned, that is a problem. Now watch, I language, okay? I language. No accusations. an expression of my feelings. Nothing wrong with saying to you, I get mad. I'm furious. Nothing wrong with that. You can tolerate that. You can hear it because I am not saying it's all your fault, you are making it happen, and you ought to be ashamed of yourself, hey? Very different. Much more likely that I'll get some cooperation. Can be used with your spouses. Next time you talk to your spouse, rather than fixing the blame and saying, you know, if you wouldn't use that kind of description. It also lends itself very nicely to planning what you're going to say in advance to somebody. It's called a mini negotiation script. And so I suggest that you think about using it. Persuasive assertion is the last of the specific assertive responses, aside from some ways of handling criticism, which I shall address in just a moment. But persuasive assertion is not really assertiveness. It falls more into the area of persuasion. I just want to highlight for you how you can make yourself, as an assertive person, more persuasive. Some of these things include items that are common sense, maybe that we have already pointed to, such as using benefit statements, telling people there's something in it for you, reminding them. However, I would caution you about something. When you say to somebody, here's a benefit to you, don't ever say it in a condescending manner. People resent that greatly. If I approach you and I say, you really ought to do this because it's good for you, you are more than likely to reject it. But let's use the example that I quite often use. If you agree to pay for this workshop, I will pass along the important information to the rest of our staff and thereby make the most of the investment, most of your money. Now, you're offering something that probably makes sense to the boss. Of course, we have chosen that example not willy-nilly, talking about workshops. But essentially, you're saying, look, I'm going to make something. I'm going to give you more than maybe you had anticipated. That quite often can get people to cooperate with you. Another one is to be for rather than against something. If you are discussing something with an individual and you want to disagree, rather than saying, your idea is not going to work, that's not going to work, which is essentially sending a negative ego message, say to them, look, I think if we do it this way, if we do it another way, here's some things that'll work better. So you give them reasons for why your opinion may work better, rather than talking against their proposal. So it's one of the techniques that has been used in the literature and in the practice of persuasion a great deal. Another one is to look for areas of agreement. Say, look, you and I are arguing about something, but, you know, we might lose sight of the fact that we have already agreed about a lot of things. We agreed about this and this and this. Now, surely, we're at an impasse. Maybe you and I are not seeing things in very opposing ways. But we've already done a lot of agreeing. We've already established groundwork for agreement. Let's go on. We can also agree about this. Or you say things like, you remember yesterday? Well, you and I didn't have any problem solving that together. And so you go on from there. Quite often we lose sight of the fact that we can see things the same way with people. Those are persuasion techniques. And the last one, be reasonable and upright. Essentially, when you're involved in an argument with somebody, quite often letting them win the argument is the best thing you can do. Those of you who have read the literature on excellence and may have even attended some seminars on excellence, the newest thing again is, and there's a resurgence of that old statement, the customer's always right, that we have to please the customer, we have to give the customer what he or she wants. That really falls in that category. Being reasonable rather than right means letting people sometimes win an argument. If they criticize you, don't defend yourself. Don't try to explain yourself. Just say, yes, I understand. Okay, how can we do it better? That's reasonable. I am willing to listen to what you have to tell me. I don't have to fight you. And quite often you can maintain relationships rather than lose them if you just give up winning an argument. 5 years from now, who's going to remember whether you won the argument or not? Do any of you wish you had learned that when you were first married? I do. I wish I had learned that a long time ago. Okay? And it's not easy to do, essentially. Those comprise the assertive responses that we normally talk about in assertiveness training. There are 3 techniques that I love to teach people, and I also like particularly well because they have saved me a great deal of discomfort in my life. They have saved many of the arguments that I used to have with my spouse and with other people, and they essentially are the 3 techniques then called the broken record, fogging, and negative assertion. It was Manuel Smith in his book, When I Say No, I Feel Guilty, who popularized those techniques. They've been around for a while under various names, and they essentially address the issue of persistence in assertiveness. Very important to hang in there and to be persistent. They also address the issue of manipulative criticism, the criticism that sometimes leaves me feeling powerless or very angry. We talked earlier about the should person, the person who says you should have or you shouldn't have, that quite often allows you or induces you to feel guilty or angry. And the 3rd technique, negative assertion, when you have made a mistake, you know you've made a mistake, and how do I respond to somebody who wants you to feel ashamed and guilty about having made a mistake? So those are the 3 techniques. The broken record essentially is being very persistent. You don't have to get mad. When people don't give you what you want right away, don't give up too easily. Just keep asking for what you want. Very good to use when you have employees who are defensive. Somebody keeps saying, boss, I couldn't help it. I've told you I couldn't help it. You say, maybe so. It could be. I understand. Yes, I see. I know you think that you couldn't help it. However, I would like for you to do this job this way instead of that. And so they come up with new explanations and new reasons. And you say, okay, I understand. I know that you think you couldn't have done it any other way. However, here's how I want you to do the work differently. And you keep saying that and saying that and saying that. And if you watch people, when you use the broken record, they just go like, I can't believe this. She's saying the same thing now for the 10th time. There was a teacher in one of my seminars not too long ago, and he said, we have a no touching rule in our high school. Kids may not touch. I mean, it's just a rule, okay? Because once they touch, they won't stop touching. And so he saw these 2 kids walking down the hall, and they were touching. They were holding hands and touchy-feely. So he approached them and he said, I just want to remind you, we have a no-touch rule in this school. And the girl said, but for heaven's sake, we were just holding hands, so what's the big deal about that? He said, I just want to remind you, there is a no-touching rule in this school. Well, I don't know what you're making such a fuss about. I mean, after all, it doesn't do any harm for me to hold his hand. I just want to remind you, there is a no-touching rule in this school. And she looked up at him finally, and she said, all he said, just repeated the same thing. And she finally looked at him, and she said, you sound like a broken record. And he said, that's right. That's what I'm using. Isn't that great? The guy swears by it. It really works wonders. If you want to return something to the store or you just want to get your way, just keep repeating it. People don't expect it. It's also doing the unexpected. They don't expect it. It'll leave you in charge, and you will eventually just break down their resistance. Okay? Just keep saying it. Just keep saying it. And until they go, oh, I give up. It's making me sick. Give it to them. Okay. Fogging, on the other hand, is an excellent strategy for dealing with manipulative criticism. Fogging means that when somebody says, you should have done this differently, you know you wouldn't be in this kind of fix if you had done it differently. All you have to do is respond by either agreeing with some truth or agreeing with the odds or in principle. We sometimes say that fogging is like throwing a ball into a bank of fog, It doesn't do any harm. There's no resistance. It does not come back, and nobody knows where it went. Illustrate this. When I first began traveling as a trainer, I didn't know that I had to dress on the plane very similarly to how I dress for a seminar, because my suitcase quite often goes in a different direction than I do, and it travels many more miles than I do. And I found myself wearing very leisurely clothes on the plane. My suitcase didn't arrive. I had nothing to wear to go on stage with the next morning. And I looked everywhere for that suitcase. Finally, out of desperation, I called my husband in Denver, and I said, would you please call the airline and see if you can find my suitcase so I don't have to make all these long-distance phone calls. It's got to be somewhere. Maybe it's still sitting at the airport. Here's what Honey said to me. You know, if you had done what I had told you, if you had packed your stuff on carry-on luggage, it wouldn't be lost. Can anybody see the potential of a fight here? Any of you? Right. Years ago, before I knew about fogging, here's exactly how I would have responded. I can guarantee it. I would have said, now, how many times do I have to tell you that I can't fit all my stuff on carry-on luggage? To which he would have said, well, that's because you always carry too much junk around with you. Now, I couldn't have left it at that. I couldn't. Last word, me, probably would have said, now comes the punch below the belt. Just because you don't care what you look like doesn't mean I don't care what I look like. Are we still talking about finding the suitcase? If things had gone well, we would have somehow backtracked and maybe gotten back to the point. But chances are also so that we would have shouted some more things at each other and one of us would have hung up the phone. Nothing accomplished. Since I learned about fogging, okay, here's how I handled that one. When he said, now mind you, you've got to be a good listener in order to respond that way. When he said, you should have done what I told you, you should have packed your stuff on carry-on luggage, there are some things I will not agree with. And one of them is to say, you are right, I should have done what you told me. I would rather bite my tongue off than to say that. But of course I don't have to say that, do I? But I can seemingly agree with maybe I should have packed my stuff on carry-on luggage. Now here's how I put it. I said, well, you're probably right. If I had packed my stuff on carry-on luggage, it may not be lost. What have I just done? Have I said anything? Have I said anything? All I have said, anything is possible in the world. Right? I didn't say you're right and I'm wrong. I didn't say yes, I should have. I didn't say, yeah, I was stupid again. Nothing. I said maybe. If I had done this, maybe this would have happened. I mean, maybe, possibly, could be. Now, he doesn't know that, though, does he? All he knows is that he doesn't know what to say. Because what is he going to say now, right? It sounds as though she agreed with me. And so that's all I said. And then I used a broken record. I said, however, would you please call the airline and see if you can find my suitcase? And so he tried one more time, and he said, yeah, but, you know, you could have saved yourself all that problem if you had just packed your luggage on carry-on. And you wouldn't always insist on checking in your luggage. So what did I say? Well, maybe so. Maybe it would have helped if I had packed my stuff on carry-on luggage and wouldn't have checked it in. Now, would you please call the airline and see if you can find my suitcase? I'm telling you right now, this technique will save you more arguments. It'll save you more anguish than a lot of things that I could have taught you today. At least that has been true for me. I use it on him all the time now.
You said there were 3 parts. Would you review those one more time? Just
Agree with some truth. Okay. Agree with the odds, which is saying probably or possibly, and agree with or in principle. Agree in principle. Right. You bet. Now when I use this on him, it doesn't matter what he says. Sometimes he'll come, and say, God, you bought enough groceries to feed the whole neighborhood. One of my pet peeves used to push my button like you wouldn't believe. You would not believe. One time I dumped all the groceries in front of him, and I made a whole pile, all the stuff that he used, and I said, this is all for you. I didn't say it like that either. I said, I want you to look at this. This is all for you. And I had made the pile, you know, I had made a cone that was real high like this. I was so mad at him. So I did, and he just sat there and looked at it and said, my wife has gone absolutely crazy. I don't need to do that anymore. Now when he says that, I'll just say, usually I'll talk to myself a little bit before I can get to that point. But I'll sort of sit back, stand back, and relax and look at him, and I talk to myself. I say to myself, well, consider the source, okay? Hey, what does he know about groceries? Anyway, and then I will sort of smile at him, and I say, well, it may be so. Maybe there is enough to feed the whole neighborhood. I don't say yes, I don't say no, just maybe. Now, would you please take the bags upstairs and put the stuff away? And he stands there. He goes, I know. He has this puzzled look on his face. I know something happened, but I don't know what it is. He said to me the other day, you have a very interesting way of responding to me. You don't seem to argue so much anymore. And so I say, that may be so. And the last one is called negative assertion, and it's simply for those situations in which you have made a mistake. People try to make you feel crummy. How could you do such a dumb thing? Don't fight it. Don't fight it. All you have to do is agree with it, because that shuts them up more quickly than anything else. If you want to shut up somebody's criticism and accusations, all you have to do is agree with them. You don't have to tear yourself down. All you have to say, when they say that was a dumb thing to do, say, yes, you're right. I wish I hadn't done it. It wasn't one of the smartest things I could have done. Oh, I'm very upset, and that was terrible and awful. I say, you have every right to be upset. And I certainly, you know, I mean, just how long are they going to keep it up? If you keep saying you have every right to be upset, no, that wasn't very smart, I agree. How long? There was a man in one of my seminars, before we talked about negative assertion, he sort of raised his hand, and he said, what do you do with a kid whom you can't criticize? I said, there's no such kid. What do you mean? You can't criticize a kid. He said, I've got a son. I've got the son. When he does something wrong, I'll call him on the carpet. I'll say, son, come here. And then I'll read him the riot act. Or at least I'll try. I'll say, don't you know? That was wrong. That was a stupid thing for you to do. And the kid just stands in front of me and nods his head, looks at me with his big eyes and says, I know, Dad. I know. I said, what's the problem? So I never know what to say after that anymore. I said, you've got one of the smartest kids in the world. He knows how to shut you up, okay? And that's negative assertion, essentially. Okay. We are almost at the end of our program, and that's as it should be. This is when I usually stop my program. The rest of the information in your workbook is intended for you to read and not for me to talk about. That's why we have given you detailed information. People sometimes say to us, why don't you include more information in the workbook? So we have included information on how to handle conflict with subordinates, how to give criticism, how to receive criticism, some guidelines that you might want to review for yourself. But essentially, those are not typical components of an assertiveness training program. What I would like to do, however, is make some final remarks to you, hoping that you will walk out of here being fired up and using what we have talked about today. Number one, never forget that you can change as a human being. Even though you have some habits and you have some very well-established habits that are on automatic pilot, you can still change. Never ever set yourself up for failure. You must set yourself up for success. How do you do that? Within the next 24 hours, I suggest you make a to-do list of situations which you would like to handle more assertively. Just take a piece of paper and make a list. Write down, here's what I want to do. I want to learn how to say this to my boss. I want to have to reprimand an employee. I want to be able to talk to my contractor who hasn't done a good enough job. I'm going to tell my spouse, okay, just a to-do list. I'm going to tell my in-laws that I don't want them to visit for 2 weeks next summer, only 2 days. And so you just write it in random order. You just write them all down. And the next thing you do is prioritize them according to easiest to hardest. You start with easiest. The easiest gets a 1, and the hardest gets a 10 or whatever, 15, however many you have. You pick out the easiest, and you start with the easiest. Don't do it. Don't take the advice that so many time management experts give you. That's good for time management. They always say do the hard work first, do the difficult tasks first when you are still fresh and up and so on, and then the easy ones will take care of themselves. In behavior change, you always start with the easiest. Otherwise, you'll set yourself up for failure. The easiest probably is, for many of you, learning how to compliment people. Okay? That may be one way you start. Or simple assertion, some other kind of simple assertion. Okay. And then you keep going. You take care of the first one, then you say, you have to keep plugging along. You have the rest of your life to become assertive. And you will make mistakes. I can promise you that. However, always remember that every time you assert yourself, you are taking care of the most valuable resource you will ever know. Who is that? Yourself. Yes, indeed. And along the way, you're going to make some mistakes. Hopefully, when you do it right, you will model it for other people. Give others lots of permission to be assertive toward you. That's not easy. When my youngest son was a teenager, I reprimanded him because he was having bad grades in high school. I had my come to Jesus meeting. I said, Martin, this kid grew up with assertiveness. And I said, Martin, you are doing badly in school. I want to let you know how disappointed I am. And I want you to shape up and do better. And he listened very carefully, and then he looked at me and he said, Mom, I guess that means neither one of us has lived up to the other's expectations. I thought I wasn't hearing right? Old habits. He could see my fist shooting up, right? The frown in my face, the evil eye. I was about to say, who do you think you're talking to? And he put out his hands and he said, just a minute, I'm just being assertive. Okay? Most people in your environment do not know about that. This kid knew. He knew I was going to react that way and said, I'm going to give her some of her own medicine. Most people in your environment don't know that. When they begin to be honest and assertive with you, you've got to give them permission to do it, even if they do it wrong. And so you help them correct. It's number one rule of teaching others how to be assertive. So model it for them, allow it to happen, and when you make mistakes, forgive yourself. The mistakes will primarily be of forgetting to speak up, of coming on too strong. Some people just, when they begin it, they just come on too strong. When that happens, forgive yourself, apologize. Always remember James Thurber's famous words. It is far better to fall flat on your face than to bend over backwards too far. Thank you for listening, for being attentive. I hope you use it and take care of yourself. Bye-bye. Thanks.
I trust that this program has given you insight and practical skills for building your influence and authority on the job. By the way, if you'd like to share these ideas with the members of your company or organization, assertiveness training or any of Career Track's seminars can be presented live at your location. You can choose a custom-designed program prepared especially for your firm in any length, from 1 hour to a full day. For details, please call our on-site department toll-free at 1-800-325-5854. Now a special bonus. It's a sample from Career Track's popular audio cassette seminar, How to Speak Up, Set Limits, and Say No by Maria Arapakis. Maria teaches you to understand your own needs, why you often feel guilty or used, and how to avoid being manipulated by others. It's a great supplement to the assertiveness skills you've just learned. Here's the sample.
I can tell you about my good friends who will remain nameless, who went back east last October to see the Colors in New England. We're supposed to have a wonderful, relaxing weekend doing the bed and breakfast in circuit. They get back stressed out to the max because they had spent a very tension-filled week. Because the couple that they were traveling with, actually it was the man of the couple that they were traveling with, was a very aggressive, dominating decision-maker. So they spent the whole week being bamboozled into rushing around at too fast a pace, staying at inns they didn't like that much, and having zero time alone together as a couple. And neither one of them ever said anything about it. And these are not shy or retarded people. These are executives. These are very assertive people in many ways in their own life. But they didn't want to conflict. They didn't want to upset the whole thing, so they said nothing. They suffered silently. And it wasn't because they weren't able to set limits. It was because they weren't willing to set them, really. Which brings us to point number 1, which is that not telling the truth does not work. And setting limits is all about truth-telling. It doesn't work for a variety of reasons. It doesn't work because, for one thing, you end up putting up with a whole lot of what you don't like and what you don't want, whether it's rushing around at a crazy pace or hearing about your coworker's sex life. It doesn't work because not only do you put up with a lot of what you don't like, you don't get what you do want, whether it's time alone or an unhurried week. It also doesn't work because when you don't tell the truth, problems repeat themselves. And so instead of getting one day of staying at an inn you don't like, you get a whole week's worth. People are not mind readers, most people anyway. And silence does imply consent. And you do teach people how you want to be treated. It also doesn't work not telling the truth because what happens is you end up suffering emotional and physical stress. Not telling the truth is hard on you physically, it's hard on your body, and it's certainly hard on you emotionally. And the last reason why it doesn't work is because it's very hard, not telling the truth is, on your relationships. The point, though, that I want to make is that I have a one-liner. LSD produces 3D. Now, I know that's a little cryptic. And I'm not talking about the LSD of the 60s or the 3D of the 50s. You remember the 3D movies where you wore the... You're telling your age, of course, when you say you remember those things. I'm talking about LSD, in this case meaning lying, suppressing, and denying. Lying, suppressing, and denying produce 3D, distance, deadening, and denial of what's so and what is possible. And it basically just does not work. Now here comes the good news. And this is the other side of point number 1. Point number 1 here is not that not telling the truth doesn't work. The other side of that is telling the truth not only works, telling the truth is a turn-on. It's a positive turn-on. It enlivens your relationships. It clears the air. It lets you know where things stand. And it frees up a whole lot of energy, which is probably the reason why a lot of people have good sex after they have a fight. Because the truth has been told, finally. And it frees up energy in some wonderfully exciting ways.
This has been a sample from How to Speak Up, Set Limits, and Say No by Maria Arapakis. To get your copy of the entire 4-cassette audio tape package, just call toll-free 1-800-334-1018. Remember our 1-year unconditional guarantee. If you are not satisfied for any reason, you have up to a full year to return the program for a refund. That's how certain we are that you'll find Career Track products to be a wise investment in yourself. Keep in mind that Career Track offers a wealth of books, tapes, and seminars on other topics designed to increase your effectiveness. These include stress management, time management, image building, self-motivation, communication, human relations, and many more programs, all with one aim, keeping you at your best. If you'd like more information, call Career Track toll-free at 1-800-336-9972. Thanks for listening, and congratulations on making Career Track your success company.